a soft descent into the Ditto Mew mystery. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to a grand temple high above the clouds, but to the dim, familiar glow of a tiny screen in your hands. The gentle chiptune hum of Route 1, the soft green of that early overworld, the way the world seemed to shrink down into pixels and yet somehow feel endless. Time slows there in that quiet space between your childhood room and Kanto's old roads. Tonight we're drifting into a different kind of mystery. Not the origin of gods or the shaping of continents, but a smaller, stranger myth that has settled over years into the corners of the fandom's sleepier thoughts. It is the story of a pink blob and a hidden legend of Ditto and Mew, and the idea that one might be the echo of the other. To this day, people still whisper that Ditto is not just a Pokémon, but a failed attempt to recreate Mew. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching that old Game Boy screen. You send out a Ditto and it melts into the shape of whatever stands before it. Somewhere else in the world, Mew drifts through myths and event distributions, sharing that same lonely move, transform. In the first generation, only these two share that strange identity-slipping trick, as if they were made from the same forgotten template. Let's begin at the very beginning, not of the world, but of this quiet theory. In ancient internet forums and early guidebooks, players noticed the coincidences stacking up. Ditto and Mew, both soft pink, both simple, rounded shapes in many sprites, both tied to the idea of copying. Ditto appears in the ruined Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, the same place where journal pages tell the story of Mew and the creation of Mewtwo. A mansion of experiments, and inside, a creature that can become anything. As you breathe slowly, imagine the developers of those first games working late into the night, compressing a whole world into the limits of a tiny cartridge. In that compressed space, things were cut, rearranged, repurposed. Some fans imagine Ditto as a leftover from that process, a byproduct of systems meant for Mew or even for creatures that never made it into the final story. Not a mistake in the harsh sense, but an accidental echo caught between design and myth. In the calm light of hindsight, Ditto can feel like a gentle misstep in balance and narrative, a universal breeding partner that quietly bends the rules of genetics, a blob with almost no story of its own, yet mechanics that touch almost every species. Our journey tonight will move slowly through fan speculation, game design clues, and development history, and then into the contradictions that keep this theory from ever becoming official canon. As we drift deeper, notice how each detail pulls at the same thread. The shared move, the color, the mansion, the way Ditto seems less like a random creature of nature and more like a soft shadow of something else. By the time we look closely at its design, its strange breeding role, and the places it appears, Ditto may start to feel less like a simple blob and more like the lingering outline of Mew itself, waiting quietly in the code for you to find it. Remembering Kanto, a world built on secrets. All of those little echoes between Ditto and Mew begin to feel different when you place them back in their original world, Kanto, as it first appeared on a tiny Game Boy screen. This wasn't a perfectly polished region with every mystery explained. It was a quiet, pixelated shore where your imagination filled in the fog. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that first walk along Route 1, the gentle music looping, the world seeming so much larger than the screen that held it. There were locked doors you could not open, odd empty rooms, and patches of grass that felt strangely important for reasons the game never stated. You learned very quickly that not every answer would be given to you directly. In those early days, the real Pokédex was whispered on playgrounds and typed hesitantly into ancient forums. Someone would mention a truck near the SS Anne, or a hidden garden where rare Pokémon gathered, and even if you had never seen it yourself, the story felt possible. The game left just enough space for myth to take root. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer wandering through a half-told tale. Generation 1 felt unfinished in a strangely magical way. Odd item descriptions, unreachable ledges, moves that seemed to do almost nothing, and NPCs who hinted at things that never quite appeared. You walked through Kanto with the sense that there were missing pieces just under the surface, as if the world had been assembled quickly and then left with its seams still showing. At the center of that feeling was Mew, a Pokémon that at first did not officially exist. It was like a ghost in the machine, tucked into the code at the very end of development, not meant for ordinary play. To this day, the idea of encountering Mew through a glitch, or at a special event, feels less like catching a creature and more like touching the hidden edge of the game itself. When a world is already full of secrets, one more secret does not sit alone. Missing note would fracture your screen and stretch the ocean into strange shapes. Items would multiply, and the borders of Kanto would briefly forget what they were supposed to be. In ancient times of the early cartridge era, it felt as if the game was alive in ways even its creators had not fully planned, not to punish, but to reset your sense of what was possible. In that environment, a Pokémon like Ditto did not feel ordinary. A small, formless presence that could become anything, yet seemed to belong nowhere in nature, with a single move that felt more like a mechanic than a behavior. When you found that soft Mew-colored blob in abandoned labs and wild patches where it did not quite belong, the pattern almost drew itself. In a Kanto already humming with glitches, rumors, and hidden data, the quiet resemblance between Ditto and Mew was enough to start a legend, and the deeper you look into where Ditto appears and what it can do, the harder that legend is to let go of. Meeting the blob. What exactly is Ditto? So before we drift any deeper into theories and hidden code, it helps to simply sit with the creature at the center of all this. Close your eyes and let your mind wander and imagine you're back in Kanto, somewhere quiet, the world reduced to soft colors and slow footsteps. In front of you is Ditto. Not a majestic dragon or an ancient guardian, but a small pastel purple shape resting on the ground. Its body is somewhere between liquid and jelly, edges gently wobbling, never quite deciding on a firm outline. There are no clear limbs, no claws or wings, just a rounded little mound with two dot eyes and a simple, almost childlike smile. It looks less like a wild animal from nature, and more like a doodle that somehow slipped out of the page and into the world. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so instead of thinking about strength, you can just watch what Ditto does. Its defining mechanic is a single, almost mystical move, transform. When you send Ditto out, it studies whatever stands across from it, and then, in a shimmer of motion, it becomes that creature. It copies the appearance, mimics the cry, and mirrors the moves, even echoing most of the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. For a moment, the world folds in on itself, and you are looking at a perfect reflection wearing someone else's skin. Among Pokémon, this is strangely rare. Most species have clear habitats, roles, and families. Pidgey grows into Pidgeotto and Pidgeot. Charmander learns to breathe fire more fiercely as time passes. Eevee blossoms into many forms depending on stones and seasons. Ditto, by contrast, stands alone. No pre-evolution, no evolution, no grand myth written into stone. Just a single, all-consuming gimmick becomes something else. When you look at Ditto's numbers, that oddness continues. Its base stats are low, its defenses fragile, its own strength almost an afterthought. Without another Pokémon to copy, Ditto is nearly helpless, relying entirely on the opponent for useful moves. It feels less like a fully realized companion and more like a tool or perhaps an experiment, designed for a specific purpose. To this day, that quiet imbalance makes it feel like a placeholder in a story about identity. In later generations, that role deepens in a different way. At the daycare, Ditto can pair with almost any partner and produce eggs, acting as a kind of universal genetic template. Where other Pokémon have carefully traced lineages, Ditto slips between them, filling gaps, smoothing edges, turning absence into possibility. It is as if the world itself is using Ditto to maintain a certain balance of life, not to punish, but to reset the flow of species when something is missing. Even the places where you first meet Ditto in Kanto feel slightly off. It appears in the ruined Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, where the air is thick with dust and half-burned journals, and in the depths of Cerulean Cave, a late-game labyrinth humming with strange, powerful presences. These are not gentle beginner routes. They are quiet, liminal spaces where the story is already fraying at the edges. Tonight we're drifting into the idea that Ditto is less an answer and more a question. A creature defined almost entirely by copying others, with so little of its own to hold on to, feels like it might be left over from something else. And if that something else was Mew, then those soft purple edges start to look less accidental and more like the echo of an ancient experiment we were never meant to see. Mew, the gentle origin of all Pokémon. And if Ditto is a question, then somewhere in this quiet world, there has to be an answer. A shape that isn't empty, but overflowing. Tonight, we're drifting into the soft origin that so many myths quietly circle around. Mew. Close your eyes and let your mind wander and picture it. Not a towering dragon or a world-shaking titan, but something small, almost weightless. A pale pink cat-like creature with a long tapering tail that curls lazily through the air, as if drawing loops in invisible water. Mew doesn't stomp or roar. It floats, suspended, like a thought that hasn't quite decided whether it belongs to the physical world at all. In ancient times, storytellers in this universe whispered that Mew carried within it the genetic code of every Pokémon. Not one lineage, not one region, but all of them, folded gently into a single being. It is less a single species and more a living blueprint, a primordial ancestor, written in soft fur and bright eyes. When you hear that, the Pokédex stops feeling like a catalogue and starts to feel like a long branching memory, with Mew resting quietly at the root. Mechanically, the games echo this myth in a way that feels almost reverent. Where most creatures learn a narrow set of moves, Mew can accept almost any TM, slipping gracefully into roles that should belong to others. It can wield beams of light, waves of water, and surges of psychic power. Yet its stats remain balanced, never tipping too far into cruelty. This isn't a weapon sharpened to a single point. It is potential, spread out in every direction. To this day, Mew is called a mythical Pokémon, and the games treat it like a secret the world is only half ready to remember. In the original Kanto adventures, it wasn't waiting on a route or in a cave. It was event only, or hidden behind glitches and rumors traded on playgrounds and in school hallways. For many players, Mew felt less like a character and more like a ghost story. A friend of a friend swore they saw it, but you never quite did. And yet, when you look at it closely, there is nothing harsh about Mew. Its expression is curious, not commanding. Its movements are playful, not imposing. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. Mew drifts through space and time like an idea about what Pokémon could be if no one ever told them they had to choose a single purpose? If any Pokémon were to inspire experiments, copies, or failed attempts, it would be this one, the ultimate template, the gentle origin, the genetic beginning of so many stories. Now that we've met the formless copy in Ditto and the quiet source in Mew, we can start to notice the strange, almost secret ways their shapes, their colors, and their roles in the world seem to echo each other, as if some ancient experiment left ripples that never quite faded. Shared shadows, the eerie similarities. Between Ditto and Mew, if you let your thoughts settle for a moment, you can almost feel those ripples circling quietly between Mew and Ditto, like rings on still water. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and we can simply notice the shapes they leave behind in the code and in the world, without needing to decide anything just yet. The first shape is made of numbers, not pixels. In the original games, both Ditto and Mew share the same base stat total, 300, divided evenly into simple, almost childlike symmetry. Where many Pokémon lean towards strength or speed, offense or defense, these two are balanced in a strangely neutral way, as if designed to be blanks rather than specialists. It feels less like two unrelated creatures and more like one idea expressed twice, a soft template waiting to be filled. Then there is their color, that gentle pastel that seems to glow at the edge of sleep. Ditto's classic purple-pink and Mew's soft, warm pink sit side by side in your memory, closer to each other than to the vivid reds of Charizard or the deep blues of Lapras. In a world painted with so many different hues, their bodies seem to share the same quiet corner of the palette, as though they were mixed from the same drop of ink in a very old sketchbook. Tonight, we're drifting into the strangest part of their connection, the move Transform. In Generation 1, only 2 Pokémon naturally know this reality-bending trick, this ability to become anything else on the field, Mew, the mythical origin, and Ditto, the formless copy. No other creature in that ancient Kanto learns it by leveling, no secret tutor offers it, no hidden machine contains it. It exists as a kind of private language between them, a whispered reminder that they share something fundamental, something the rest of the world only witnesses from the outside. Their bodies echo each other in quieter ways, too. Both are small and light, easy to overlook when you imagine legendary power or late-game challenges. Mew curls like a kitten in empty space, weightless and playful. Ditto rests as a little puddle, almost nothing at all. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing how the smallest shapes can contain the largest myths. To this day, their paths through Kanto feel strangely aligned. Mew hides as an event reward, a glitch-born secret outside the normal map, while Ditto appears in places that feel just as liminal, the mysterious Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo waits in the dark, and the ruined Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar, filled with journals about a new Pokémon. In ancient times, stories like these would be told as warnings around a fire, not to punish, but to reset the balance between curiosity and caution. Taken one by one, these are just similarities. But when you let them rest together, the stats, the color, the size, the move, the hidden locations, they begin to feel like shared shadows on the same wall. And if you quietly follow Ditto's trail through Kanto's strangest places, the thought begins to grow that you're not just tracking a simple blob, but the scattered footprints of a failed Mew, leading us deeper into the heart of the experiment. Playground Whispers. How the Ditto Mew theory was born. In those shadows, you're not alone. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to data miners' spreadsheets or official timelines, but to a quieter world before all of that existed, when the only canon you had was whatever your friends whispered to you at recess. There was a time before wikis, before neatly organized type charts and hidden values, when knowledge moved slowly from playground to playground, like a gentle wind. You learned about missing numbers from a cousin, about the Elite Four from a magazine left on a bus seat, about Mew from a blurry screenshot that might have been real or might have been a dream. This wasn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, piecing together a myth from scraps and rumors. In that ancient feeling age of link cables and flickering CRT screens, the world of Kanto felt vast because so much of it was unknown. Stories spread that under a certain truck near the harbor, Mew was hiding, waiting for a secret sequence of moves. Others insisted there were hidden evolutions, secret forms, and keys you could only unlock if you believed hard enough. These myths were wild, but they created a kind of balance. For every official line of text, there were 10 soft, unofficial ones written in the air by children. Within that atmosphere, Ditto and Mew slipped together almost naturally. Players noticed that Mew, this elusive, almost sacred being, could use transform, and that somewhere else in the game, a shapeless little blob could do the same. They saw the shared soft pink in later sprites, the similar rounded silhouettes, the way both seemed to exist slightly outside the usual rules of nature. Mew was hidden behind events and glitches, while Ditto appeared in strange places, including the ruined Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar, where the story of Mewtwo's creation was scattered across dusty journals. Tonight, we're drifting into those early message boards and fan sites where these scattered thoughts began to crystallize. On simple web pages, in monochrome forums, and in long text, FAQs copied and saved on family computers, someone would quietly suggest, "What if Ditto is a failed Mew clone?" Others would answer with their own observations, refining the story, repeating it, passing it along. Over time, the theory became less a single idea and more a shared legend. It was a legend with a satisfying shape. Mew as the ancient original, pure and full of possibility. Ditto as the discarded attempts, the formless echoes left behind by human ambition. Mewtwo as the one successful, weaponized outcome, born not to punish, but to reset humanity's arrogance. The games only implied pieces of this arc, but the community gently filled in the gaps like ink seeping into paper. To this day, the Ditto Mew theory feels like more than an argument about stats or encounter tables. It belongs to a larger culture of fan-made lore, a quiet tradition where players look at the empty spaces between official lines and decide to dream together. In that sense, Ditto isn't just a possible mistake in Kanto's code, it's part of a collective dream, a soft story people told themselves so that every leftover, every glitch, every pink shadow in time and space might mean something more. And as you drift deeper, those shared dreams will lead us from rumor into the strange, half-forgotten laboratories where Kanto's experiments truly began. The science of glitches, Gen 1's unfinished edges. From those laboratories in rumor and dream, we can gently pull back and look at the world that created them. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to the wild grass of Kanto, but to a small office in late 1980s Japan, where a tiny team is trying to fit an entire universe into a cartridge scarcely bigger than your thumb. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer watching code become creatures under quiet fluorescent light. The original red and green and later red and blue were not born in comfort. They were shaped under strict limits of time and space, with memory measured in precious kilobytes and deadlines pressing in like walls. Every idea had to be folded, compressed, simplified until only its barest essence could remain. In that compressed world, every line of code was a promise, and sometimes a compromise. When a world is built at that scale, strange currents begin to appear. Data bleeds into neighboring spaces, numbers wrap around, And if a curious player steps just slightly outside the intended path, the game reveals its unfinished edges. You meet things like Missing No, a glitch Pokémon that is less a creature and more a footprint in memory, a reminder that underneath the gentle story on the screen, there is a fragile structure straining to hold everything together. Tonight, we're drifting into that fragile layer, the space where quirks become myths. In Genesis 1, item lists overflow, trainers appear where they should not, and the sea itself can conjure impossible encounters if you surf along the right shoreline. To this day, people remember the first time the screen filled with scrambled shapes and strange cries, not as an error, but as a secret door into the game's hidden nature. Some of those secrets were intentional. Mew, the tiny ancestor of so many legends, was added almost as a whisper at the end of development, slipped into unused memory by a programmer who simply wanted to experiment. It was never meant to appear in ordinary play, never meant to stand beside you on Route 1. It was a ghost in the code, an ancient presence tucked between numbers. In ancient times, myths grew from cracks in understanding, and Genesis 1 feels very much the same. Features were crammed in, then cut, sprites were rearranged, ideas were half implemented and left as quiet artifacts. The result is a world that hums with leftover possibilities, where every odd encounter suggests something that used to be there, or almost was. Within that half-finished tapestry, a Pokémon like Ditto makes a peculiar kind of sense. Simple, almost featureless, defined almost entirely by a single move that rewrites its form. It feels less like a fully realized character and more like a tool, a mechanic given just enough shape to stand on its own. In a development environment full of repurposed data and hidden experiments, Ditto could easily be the echo of another idea, a leftover template that never quite found its original role. Later interviews with the developers quietly confirm this atmosphere of improvisation, last-minute additions, hidden creatures, and choices made to preserve balance rather than to serve some grand, orderly plan. And so, as you drift deeper into sleep, you might gently wonder what happens when we look at Ditto not as a perfectly planned being, but as a side effect of trying to hide and handle Mew itself, a soft pink ripple left behind by a secret the game was never quite ready to contain. Inside the lab, Cinnabar Mansion, and the echo of experiments. And if that ripple had to come from somewhere, from some physical place in the world, your thoughts are gently pulled toward a ruined house on the edge of the sea. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to Cinnabar Island, not the lively gym or the warm coastline, but the quiet shape of the Pokémon Mansion, half swallowed by nature. Vines curl through shattered windows, tiles lie broken under your feet, and the air feels heavy with dust and time. Old machines sit in corners like forgotten fossils of human ambition, their screens dark, their panels cracked, wires hanging like dried roots. As you move through its empty halls in your mind, you can almost hear the soft rustle of wild Pokémon that do not quite belong to the surface world outside. Rattata slip through holes in the walls, coughing drift lazily above collapsed desks, and somewhere deeper in, there is the sense of something stranger, something that doesn't have a proper shape at all. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer drifting through a place that remembers more than it can say. Scattered across the mansion's ruined laboratories lie scraps of a story told in the simplest way. Diary entries, dated and plain, yet quietly mythic. They speak of a faraway land, of a rare Pokémon discovered in the jungle, a small ancient creature named Mew. Let's begin at the very beginning. Excitement, curiosity, the feeling that nature had revealed a secret. Then, over a few lines, that wonder is turned inward, into experiments, into cloning, into the creation of something new. The name appears almost casually, Mewtwo, and with it, the tone shifts from hopeful to uneasy, as if the ink itself grows heavier. You never see the experiment directly, you only feel it through these traces as the entries hint at power growing beyond control, at a presence that could no longer be contained in this quiet mansion. To this day, those simple lines may be some of the most haunting words in the series because they ask you to imagine the rest. And wandering among these echoes in the very same mansion where Mew's DNA was studied and stretched, you can encounter Ditto, a small, soft, formless creature appearing here of all places as if it simply melted out of one of those shattered tanks. Ditto does not remember a single shape. It does not claim an identity, it only imitates. Gently, an idea settles in the back of your mind. What if Ditto is what happened when the experiment did not work? Not a perfected clone, but a half-remembered one, a body without a stable pattern, reduced to a universal template that can only copy others. Where Mewtwo is sharp edges and clear intent, Ditto is a puddle of uncertainty, a pink question that never quite resolves. In a world where humans tried to sculpt the ultimate Pokémon from ancient genes, it feels natural that not every attempt would reach the same conclusion. Some results would be too unstable, too soft, slipping through the cracks. Perhaps a few simply oozed out into the wild, becoming the Dittos you meet, quietly keeping the secret of their origin. The contrast is almost poetic. On one side, Mewtwo, towering strength, psychic storms, a legend born from pushing nature past its balance. On the other, Ditto, a smile, a wobble, a harmless mimic that seems almost like an apology. Two outcomes of the same ambition, one remembered in statues and cutscenes, the other hiding in plain sight, pretending to be everyone and no one. Tonight, we're drifting into the thought that Cinnabar Mansion is not the only place where the world itself seems to place Ditto near hidden experiments. Because when you look beyond this ruined lab and trace where Ditto appears elsewhere, its quiet footsteps seem to lead you toward other secrets the games never quite explain. Cerulean Cave, where legends and leftovers meet. From Cinnabar's broken tiles and burnt notes, your mind can drift north, over forests and fields to a place the story almost hides from you. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine the mouth of Cerulean Cave, a quiet opening in the rock, guarded by water, sealed away until the world itself decides you are ready to see what rests inside. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing the edges of a myth. Cerulean Cave in Kanto feels less like a normal dungeon and more like a forgotten pocket of space carved out for legends and leftovers. Inside, the air grows cool and still, the light fades, and each step takes you deeper into a maze where time seems to slow, as if the world is holding its breath around you. The Pokémon here are different from the roots and gentle grass outside. Wild creatures appear at unusually high levels, strong and rare, as though they wandered in from some other region entirely. It feels out of balance with the rest of Kanto in a deliberate way, a quiet signal that this is where the usual rules loosen, where the story becomes more secretive and strange. At the deepest point, beyond ladders and pools and twisting paths, waits Mewtwo. Not announced by dialogue, not framed by cutscenes, simply present as a silent guardian of its own solitude. In ancient times, storytellers might have placed a dragon in such a chamber. Here, the game places a psychic clone born from human curiosity and loss. You only meet it after becoming champion, as if the world is saying that glory is one story, and confronting what humans have created is another. Tonight, we're drifting into the thought that the company Mewtwo keeps in this cave is part of that quiet story. Among these powerful, rare Pokémon, Ditto appears again. A small, seemingly weak creature with low stats, no evolution, and a single, strange move, sharing space with one of the most formidable beings in the region. On paper, it does not belong here, and yet it is here, waiting in the dark. If Mewtwo is the final, refined result of the Mew project, then Ditto's presence beside it feels less like a coincidence and more like a soft echo. Perhaps these amorphous forms are remnants of earlier attempts, unstable shapes that slipped away from laboratories and drifted toward hidden places, drawn back to the same quiet corners where their perfected sibling now resides. Pokémon often tells its deeper stories through space rather than words. Where a creature appears, which rooms it haunts, which caves remember it, can say as much as any Pokédex entry. Cerulean Cave and the Pokémon Mansion form a subtle loop, from the ruined site of experiments to the secluded lair of their ultimate result, with Ditto quietly present at both ends of the journey. To this day, nothing in the games states this outright. But in a world where Mew itself is almost entirely unspoken, these shared spaces begin to feel like an unvoiced confession, a gentle hint that Ditto's true origin might be hiding not in dialogue, but in the places where it silently waits for you in the dark. Transform, a move that feels like a prototype. And in those dark, quiet corners, Ditto is waiting with one more secret: the way it moves. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine that soft, formless shape doing something almost impossible for this early, simple world of pixels and numbers. In the first games, Transform is not just a trick, but an entire temporary reality. When Ditto uses it, it copies the opponent's species, their appearance, their form moves, and even a version of their stats, reshaping itself into a careful mirror. Yet somewhere beneath that borrowed form, Ditto's own HP quietly remains, like a hidden heartbeat that never changes, no matter what mask it wears. For a few turns, the game pretends that two of the same creature are facing one another, sharing the same moves, the same silhouette, the same quiet pose. If you listen closely to what the code is doing, Transform feels less like a normal move and more like a tool, something closer to a developer's experiment than a simple command. It touches almost every system at once: sprites, move lists, damage calculations, even the way the world decides who moves first. This isn't a small effect that nudges numbers, it is a temporary rewriting of identity, a moment where the game says, just for now, you are something else. To this day, in those original cartridges, only 2 Pokémon truly own this strange power without outside help: Ditto and Mew. Others might learn it later through unusual means, but in Kanto's first quiet story, Transform is their shared secret, a thread tying a mythical ancestor and an odd little blob together. It feels less like a coincidence and more like a whispered connection, hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we're drifting into the idea that Ditto itself may have begun as a kind of internal tool, a simple, malleable shape for testing how transformations behaved, how sprites lined up, how moves interacted when one creature became another. Perhaps in those early days of limited memory and shifting plans, this testing shape was given a name, a cry, and a place in the tall grass, promoted from experiment to inhabitant of the world. If Mew is the genetic template, the gentle origin that can learn almost any move, then Transform makes perfect sense as part of its myth. A being of pure possibility should be able to become anything, but a failed echo of that being, a clone that never quite stabilized, might be left with only that function, able to mimic every form while never remembering its own. In ancient times, at the very start of the series, Transforms strained against the limits of the hardware, leading to odd quirks and small bugs when forms stacked, when copied, moves copied again, when numbers bent in ways the designers barely had time to smooth. It sat in the same era as hidden Mew data and glitchy shores, a reminder that this world was still being born. When you look at Ditto through the lens of Transform, As if that single move is its entire reason to exist, it begins to feel less like a creature of nature and more like a leftover mechanic with eyes, a piece of the game's machinery that wandered out of the code and into the grass, waiting for you to find it. And yet, this quiet leftover will become even more important when you leave the original cartridges behind and step into a world where Pokémon can leave eggs behind and genetics become a gentle, playable myth. Stats, shapes, and silence. Design, echoes. Between Ditto and Mew, in this new world of eggs and quiet genetics, Ditto and Mew begin to feel less like strangers and more like reflections, two shapes pressed gently against opposite sides of the same glass. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, and imagine the game itself laying out its pieces on a small, flickering board, repeating patterns when it finds something that works. One of those patterns sits in their numbers. Both Mew and Ditto share a modest base stat total, spread so evenly that nothing stands out, nothing dominates. Where other Pokémon lean into clear roles with speed that darts ahead or strength that towers over the rest, these two are almost perfectly balanced, as if the designers smoothed every edge down until no single stat had a sharp corner. They are not made to overpower, they are made to become. Visually, they echo each other in a softer way. Mew is a defined cat-like creature with a long tail that curves through space like a question mark, a small body that feels light enough to drift through a dream. Ditto, by contrast, looks like that same idea after the lines have been erased, a melted, simplified silhouette, as though Mew's form has been gently wiped away, leaving only a soft outline and two dots for eyes. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing silhouettes in the dark. Their colors whisper the same story. Both sit in that pastel pink family, a quiet, almost toy-like shade that feels harmless and kind. Both are small, compact, easy to imagine cupped in two hands. Together they feel like two stages of the same thought, one fully realized with ears and paws and a playful curve to its tail, the other barely formed, a puddle of potential waiting to be told what to be. Mechanically, the connection deepens. In ancient times of the series, in that very first generation, only Mew and Ditto could access Transform on their own. For Mew, Transform is just one possibility among almost endless moves, a reminder that this ancient little creature can learn nearly anything, bending toward whatever the world asks of it. Ditto, meanwhile, is locked into that single trick, Transform as its entire identity, like a prototype that never graduated past its first successful test. Around them, the story stays quiet. No NPC in Kanto wonders where Ditto came from. Mew exists only in scattered Cinnabar Mansion notes and distant, almost secret events. To this day, the games never sit you down and explain how these two are connected. They simply leave the pieces near each other and step away. In a game built under tight limits of time and space, where sprites, numbers, and ideas had to be reused, it would be efficient and strangely poetic for a failed Mew clone to share its data and design DNA. Tonight, we're drifting into that possibility, standing at the edge of coincidence and intention, and in the next quiet stretch, we'll ask whether these echoes were planned or whether they are beautiful accidents left behind by a rushed, dreaming world. From code to creature, could Ditto be cut content reborn? Beautiful accidents left behind by a rushed, dreaming world. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, not through forests or cities, but through something quieter. A developer's desk in the late 1990s, where code and sketches share the same small pool of light. In game creation, especially in that era, ideas did not arrive fully formed. They were tried, adjusted, set aside, and sometimes quietly reborn under new names, shaped as much by memory limits and deadlines as by grand design. Long before you met these creatures as companions, they existed as numbers and pixels squeezed into a tiny space on a Game Boy cartridge. When room grew scarce, nothing could be wasted. A half-finished concept might be tucked away for later, a test model might be renamed, and an abandoned creature might leave only a ghost in the data. To this day, early Pokémon development is full of such ghosts. Unused sprites hidden in prototype builds, strange beta designs that hint at creatures who almost joined the world, and glitch Pokémon that feel like echoes of ideas that never quite settled. Missing No is the most famous of these, a quiet reminder that the game's internal world was being stretched to its edges. When you encountered it, you weren't meeting a planned character, but the exposed scaffolding of the simulation itself. Alongside it, other glitch forms flickered into view, shapes that did not belong, as if the cartridge were whispering, "There used to be something here." In that same age of experimentation, it is gentle to imagine Ditto as one of those whispers that was invited to stay. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. So picture a simple test creature on a developer's screen, a formless blob built to check whether transform worked, whether a Pokémon could copy another's moves and shape without breaking the fragile balance of the system. Perhaps it was used to prototype Mew's own transform, or to simulate cloning events tied to Cinnabar's hidden experiments. Instead of deleting this tool when its work was done, the team may have polished it just enough, giving it a small face, a single, complex move, and a place in the tall grass. That would explain so much of Ditto's quiet strangeness. It does not evolve. Its Pokédex entries are vague, circling around its ability rather than its origin, as if the story were never fully written. Its entire identity rests on one intricate mechanic, while its design remains as minimal as possible, a soft, pink suggestion of a creature rather than a fully realized myth. It feels less like a carefully planned inhabitant of nature and more like a concept promoted to full Pokémon status late in development, when there was no time or space to give it deeper roots. Tonight, we're drifting into the thought that Ditto is not only a lore mistake but a structural one, a repurposed experiment that never quite found its place in the world it inherited. And if that is true, then the real question is not how Ditto was made, but what happens to the delicate balance of story and gameplay when a leftover test subject is allowed to quietly reshape everything around it, breeding, blueprints, and the universal partner. And in a quiet way, you have already seen the first half of that reshaping. Ditto as a lore echo, a soft reflection of Mew's strange, origin-shaped shadow. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, because now the other half appears, not in ancient journals or ruined mansions, but in something far more domestic and gentle, a little house at the edge of a route with a fence, a field, and a daycare. In later generations, you are told a simple story. If you leave two compatible Pokémon with the daycare couple, and if they get along, an egg will appear. Not through contests or glory, but through quiet continuity. Species carry on, lines are preserved, and time moves forward in a small, circular way. It feels peaceful, almost like the world itself is breathing in its sleep. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer watching nature repeat itself in miniature. Two Pokémon share a space, wander the little yard, and after some time, a new life is waiting for you. There is a sense of balance here, effort on your part, care on theirs, and a reward that is not power, but possibility. Then Ditto steps into this system and everything changes. While most Pokémon follow careful rules of egg groups and genders, Ditto simply ignores those boundaries. It can pair with almost any partner, from ordinary creatures to rare and fragile species that otherwise could not continue their line. It doesn't matter who stands beside it in that fenced-in world. Ditto becomes the universal partner, the quiet stand-in, the blank page that lets another story be written. When you remember that Mew is described as the ancestor of all Pokémon, holding the genetic code of every species, this mechanic starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a mechanical myth. Ditto's strange universal compatibility echoes Mew's lore in gameplay form. Where Mew contains all possibilities within itself, Ditto becomes the tool that unlocks those possibilities for everything else. To this day, there is no official line that says Ditto is a failed Mew clone, yet the breeding system almost whispers it anyway. Even if no one planned it at the very beginning, later generations accidentally lean into the idea that Ditto is a genetic leftover, repurposed as infrastructure. It is there to make the system work, to keep the dream of completion alive for you. In that sense, Ditto's greatest importance is almost purely mechanical and meta. Players cherish it as a breeding engine, a way to perfect nature's IVs and hidden traits, but the games rarely pause to give Ditto a personal story. It exists more as a function than as a character, and there is something quietly poetic in that. A failed reflection of the origin Pokémon, unable to become anything of its own for long, spending its days in a small yard, so that every other species can continue. Powerful in practice, but narratively homeless, Ditto drifts through the world as a tool more than a presence, hinting that somewhere behind the code, a deeper story was started and never fully told. When a Pokémon feels like a placeholder, so when you step back for a moment, and you see Ditto drifting through the world as this quiet, pink utility, a gentle question begins to form in the back of your mind. Not an accusation, not a harsh judgment, but a softer wondering, like a thought you have just before sleep. What if Ditto isn't bad, but simply out of tune with the rest of the story? Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can feel the difference. Most Pokémon, even the small and unassuming ones, seem to rest comfortably in their place, balanced between nature, myth, and the little human stories that surround them. Ditto, by contrast, feels like a single idea stretched very thin. One move, transform. Frail, almost fragile stats. No evolution to grow into, no pre-evolution to hint at an origin. Its lore is vague, almost absent, and to make sense of it you find yourself reaching outward into breeding mechanics, strange encounter locations, and fan-made theories just to give it weight. When you compare this to the other mysteries of Kanto, the contrast becomes even clearer. Mew, hidden and elusive, carries the myth of being the ancestor of nearly all Pokémon, a tiny creature that somehow holds the genetic memory of the world. Mewtwo stands in the ruins of Cinnabar's experiments, a living consequence of human ambition, its story written in broken journal pages and quiet laboratories. Even the legendary birds Articuno, Zapdos and Moltres have the dignity of guardians, perched at the edges of land, sea and sky, each with a clear place in the map of time and space. Next to them, Ditto sometimes feels like a placeholder that never quite graduated into a legend or even a full character. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And in that dream you might picture a test object, a simple blob used by the developers to see if Transform would work, that somehow wandered into the final Pokédex and was given a number but not a story. Without the Ditto Mew theory to wrap around it like a blanket, Ditto risks feeling like leftover code, present but unexplained. Its role in the first games reinforces that feeling. In Kanto, using Ditto in a serious way often leads to gentle frustration. Transforming costs a turn, its copied stats rarely shine, and by the time you meet it in places like the Pokémon Mansion or the late-game routes, you already have companions who feel more purposeful, more naturally woven into your quiet journey. Ditto becomes a novelty, something you try once or twice then set aside. All of this together, mechanically awkward, narratively thin, leaning heavily on your imagination, creates the sense that Ditto might be less a carefully carved myth and more a byproduct of rushed creation from an era when the world of Pokémon was still crystallizing. Tonight, we're drifting into that uneasy space where a beautiful theory about Mew tries to fill the gaps. And yet, to this day, something about this little blob still doesn't quite settle comfortably inside the official canon, like a dream that almost fits, but not quite. Cracks in the myth when canon pushes back. And yet, inside that almost fitting dream, there is a kind of comfort. The Ditto Mew theory feels like the world quietly arranging itself, all the scattered pieces of your childhood memory sliding into a single, satisfying line. Ditto's pink, Mew's pink, the strange, shared move transform the quiet rooms of the Cinnabar Mansion where cloning was whispered about in old burned journals. It all folds together into a gentle, haunting story about failure, memory, and second chances. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, over how neatly it all seems to work. Ditto appears in the same mansion where Mewtwo's creation is recorded. Ditto can pair with almost any partner in the day care, like a universal template of nature itself. Mew, the so-called ancestor of all Pokémon, can also become anything, wearing every shape in the world as if it remembers them from an ancient time. On the surface, the symmetry is almost too perfect. But when you move from feeling to text, from myth to the quiet lines of official lore, the edges begin to blur. The games, the Pokédex, the guidebooks, they do not speak Mew's name when they describe Ditto. They do not whisper of labs or failed experiments. Instead, they speak calmly of a strange creature that copies others down to the smallest detail, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes with a little, almost endearing flaw. Across regions and remakes, from Kanto to Galar, Ditto's entries focus on that single, peculiar gift, transformation. It imitates its target's appearance and moves. It lives in caves, grass, and cities as if it simply belongs to the natural fabric of this world. No mention of Cinnabar's machines, no hint that it slipped from a broken test tube. To this day, the canon treats Ditto not as a scar of science, but as a quiet, wandering mimic. At the same time, later games have added more layers around Mew, cloning, and genetics that make the picture even murkier. We learn more about Mewtwo's creation, about researchers pushing at the limits of life, about artificial Pokémon shaped by human hands. The lore around these experiments grows more detailed, more specific, while Ditto remains curiously untouched, hovering at the edges of the story like an unanswered question. It is here that another possibility appears, softer, but no less interesting. Perhaps some of those mechanical echoes between Ditto and Mew are not secret messages, but side effects, practical choices, transform as a convenient move to test systems, a shared color chosen for simplicity, a universal breeding partner created to keep your Pokédex dreams from stalling. Not deliberate myth, but quiet necessity. Tonight, we're drifting into that delicate unweaving, not to punish, but to reset your expectations, strand by strand. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing where the Ditto Mew story frays against what the games actually show. Because even if Ditto is not truly a failed clone, it may still be a kind of mistake, a leftover piece that never found its place in the official tale. And as we step into that space between fan legend and written canon, Ditto's true nature begins to feel less certain, and in that uncertainty, more quietly haunting than ever. What happens when we follow those loose threads all the way to the end? The lab that never slept. Reimagining Cinnabar's experiments. So we follow them one by one, down a corridor that no longer quite belongs to the present. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can place yourself at the edge of Cinnabar Island's Pokémon Mansion, long after the tourists and trainers have gone, when the world outside is only waves and wind and a distant, steady hush. Tonight, we're drifting into its quiet heart. The front doors hang crooked on rusted hinges, and as you step through, broken glass crunches softly underfoot, half swallowed by moss that has crept in from the edges. The air is cool and a little damp, carrying the faint scent of dust and old chemicals, of paper that has forgotten how many years it has been here. Somewhere deeper inside, a light flickers, not steady, but in slow, uncertain pulses, as if the building itself is struggling to stay awake. You move down a staircase with its railing missing in places, past walls stained with age and ivy. In the distance, you hear the gentle echo of wild Pokémon cries, muffled by layers of concrete and time, as if the mansion is trying to remember what it once contained. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, walking through a memory that belongs as much to the world's myths as to its maps. In one ruined room, half collapsed to the sky, you find the journals. In the games, they are simple lines of text, but here you can imagine them as scattered notebooks on a cracked tile floor, their pages curling at the edges. July 5th, Guyana, South America, a new Pokémon was discovered deep in the jungle. July 10th, we christened the newly discovered Pokémon Mew. February 6th, Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. To this day, those are the words we are given. They speak of discovery and naming, of a single, miraculous offspring, but they are strangely quiet about everything that might have happened in between. There is no list of failed trials, no gentle admission of mistakes, no description of what it meant to turn a mythical being into data, and data into something that could open its eyes. In ancient times, legends were passed down with gaps on purpose, spaces where listeners could breathe and wonder. Here, in this modern myth wrapped in concrete and lab coats, the gaps feel just as deliberate. A project as complex as cloning Mew would almost certainly have required many attempts, many partial successes, many strange, shifting results that almost held together and then did not. It is in that unspoken space that Ditto slips in, not as proof, but as a possibility. You can imagine a tank in one of these ruined rooms, once filled with pale fluid, where something pink and formless floated, trying to decide what it was. A universal template. A body that knew only how to become other things but never itself. An echo of Mew's genetic freedom without Mew's gentle, playful soul. The journals do not say, but we created Ditto. They do not say, the experiment failed. Yet the mansion is full of small environmental whispers. In some versions of the games, wild Ditto live here, in the same corridors where Mewtwo's story is recorded. Players noticed. They walked through these pixelated halls, met a Ditto in the wild, and felt a quiet click in the back of their minds. What if these creatures, endlessly transforming, were the leftovers of abandoned tests released or escaped when the project moved on? What if the mansion, in addition to being a monument to Mewtwo, is also a graveyard of ideas, where Ditto survives as a soft, living reminder of a scientist's ambition to recreate Mew? Not to punish, but to reset. The world seems to have let nature reclaim the laboratories, covering the tiles with moss, letting the ocean air erase the sharp edges of what was done here. In that reading, every wild Ditto you encounter in the mansion becomes part of a quiet, speculative story. It is not canon, not confirmed in any official text, but a dream layered over sparse facts. You are free to walk these halls as they are written, or to see in every flicker of broken light a hint of experiments that never made it into the logs. As you linger in this imagined darkness, listening to the soft sounds of unseen Pokémon moving through the ruins, another question begins to form, gentle and persistent. If Ditto is the echo, the leftover, then what does that say about the way this world treats its mistakes, and how many other errors might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone like you to notice? Shared DNA, pink, weightless, and strangely familiar. In that quiet question, something softer begins to surface, like a shape rising out of mist. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and place Ditto and Mew side by side in your imagination. At first, you are not comparing data or decoding secrets, you are simply looking. Two small, light creatures, both a gentle shade of pink, both made of rounded lines and soft curves, as if the world had only just finished sketching them and never quite inked the details. Their bodies feel almost weightless, like ideas more than animals, with no sharp edges, no armor, nothing that suggests hardness or age. Ditto is a simple blob with a faint smile. Mew is a curled, kitten-like figure with a long tail, but they share that same unfinished softness, that newborn quality, as though they both slipped into this space before the artists were done. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, watching two simple shapes and wondering why they feel so strangely familiar. Then, in the quiet, a number appears. In the early Pokédex data, both Ditto and Mew are recorded at exactly 8.8 pounds. It is such a tiny detail, so easy to overlook, and yet, to this day, it has echoed through fan discussions like a small bell. Out of all the weights that could have been chosen, these two share the same one, as if the scale could not tell them apart. On the early internet, in dimly lit rooms and late-night message boards, that single number became a kind of secret handshake, a quiet sign that maybe the myths about them were connected. Beyond their shapes and their weight, there is the way they move through possibility. Mew, in the stories, is the ancestor of all Pokémon, carrying every gene, able to learn almost any move, a living archive of potential. Ditto, by contrast, knows almost nothing on its own, but with Transform it can become nearly anything it encounters. Two different paths to the same idea, a creature that is all potential, all change. Even in their earliest sprites you can feel this kinship. Mew's animations show it twirling, flipping, almost playing with the air around it. Ditto's simple form wobbles and melts, its face reappearing on borrowed shapes, giving it a playful, malleable presence. They feel like two expressions of the same quiet myth, one graceful and mythical, one awkward and experimental, sharing a single underlying dream. Of course, some of this may be coincidence. In ancient times of game development with limited memory and simple tools, designers reused ideas, simplified forms, and worked within narrow constraints. A shared color, a matching weight, a similar softness could be practical choices rather than hidden messages. And yet your heart, not your spreadsheet, is the one listening. Tonight, we're drifting into the space where intention and interpretation blur, where a reused concept can still feel like a secret. Imagine the designers sitting with a single notion, a soft, shapeless, all-potential being. First, they make Mew the mythical origin, a quiet god of genetics. Then perhaps they turn that same idea inside out and create Ditto, the failed echo, the leftover clay, not to punish, but to reset the concept, to explore what happens when perfection is smudged. As you rest with that image, you can feel the next question forming, wondering not just whether Ditto came from Mew, but what it means for a world to keep both the masterpiece and the mistake. Transform. When a move becomes a story. You can almost see that question hovering in the air, like a soft, unfinished sketch. If Mew is the masterpiece and Ditto is the smudge, what tool connects them? Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and that tool takes a simple, familiar name: transform. Transform on the surface is very quiet. One turn, one choice, and a Pokémon simply lets go of its own shape and slips into another. In mechanical terms, it copies the opponent's appearance, it mirrors their moves, and it reshapes its own stats to echo the target, though never perfectly, never completely. In the stillness of a turn-based world where most moves are numbers pushing against numbers, Transform feels almost magical, like the game itself is pausing to say, for a moment, you can be something else. In ancient times of the series, in Generation 1, that magic was rare. Only 3 Pokémon naturally carried Transform inside their move lists: Ditto, Mew, and later through events and story, Mewtwo. That tiny shared thread in a whole world of creatures and techniques felt like an accidental confession. To this day, players remember noticing that overlap and feeling a small shiver of connection, as if the code had whispered that these 3 were part of a single, hidden story. For Mew, Transform feels like play. The lore calls Mew the ancestor of all Pokémon, a gentle seed of infinite potential drifting through time and space. When Mew uses Transform, it is as though it is remembering its children, trying on their shapes with affectionate curiosity, exploring nature's possibilities just because it can. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a being so complete that imitation becomes a kind of art. For Ditto, the same move lands differently. Transform is not a flourish or a game, it is survival. Ditto's own stats are low, its natural form fragile and simple, almost unfinished. Without Transform it has nothing, so it waits and it reacts. It becomes whatever stands before it, not as a choice born of freedom, but as its only real trick, its quiet way of staying relevant in a world that might otherwise pass it by. If Mew represents infinite potential, then Ditto feels like constrained potential, locked behind glass. It can become anything, but only after something else appears first, only in response, only as an echo. It never gets to define the scene on its own terms. Many players meeting Transform for the first time through Ditto in places like the Pokémon Mansion felt that strange mix of wonder and frustration, the awe of a perfect copy, and the disappointment of realizing that underneath, the numbers still sag, and so Transform stops feeling like just a move and starts to look like a symbol, a quiet myth about identity and imitation, about the distance between an original and its reflection. Tonight we're drifting into that space between, where code becomes metaphor and a pink blob becomes a question. If Transform can do all this, what happens when humans start reaching for it too? Stats that don't quite add up, a Ditto versus Mew on paper. To follow that question, we need something very simple and very human, numbers on a page. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, and imagine that every Pokémon in this world of color and sound also has a quiet row of numbers hidden beneath it, like a secret name. These are base stats, the game's gentle way of saying how strong, how quick, how sturdy a creature might be without asking you to do any real mathematics at all. You do not need to see the exact figures to feel the pattern. Mew, the mythical seed of so many stories, is famous among players for one thing in particular: perfect balance. 100 points in every category, from its health to its strength, from its defenses to its speed. A smooth, even circle of power. In a world where so many creatures lean heavily in one direction, Mew stands in the center, adaptable, ready for almost any role. It can learn almost every move, and its numbers quietly support that idea, as if the universe itself agreed that this small pink being should be able to become whatever the moment requires. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you can simply feel the symmetry rather than calculate it. Mew's stats tell a myth about origin and possibility, about a creature that holds in its tiny body the potential of many others. To this day, that even spread has become a kind of shorthand for perfection in the community, a numerical halo around an already sacred figure. Now place Ditto beside it on that invisible page. The contrast is almost startling. Ditto's base stats are low in nearly every direction, like a sketch drawn with the lightest possible pencil. Its health is meager, its defense is fragile, its speed only barely enough to keep it from always moving last. On paper, before it uses Transform, Ditto is one of the weakest presences in the entire Pokédex, more suggestion than substance. The idea, of course, is that Transform will make up the difference. In theory, once Ditto has copied its partner, it should stand as an equal. But in the early generations, the mechanics turned this dream into something more awkward. Ditto had to endure at least one hit before it could transform, meaning its already low health and defenses were tested immediately. Even after changing shape, it often kept its original tiny health pool, a glass shell wrapped around borrowed power. In ancient times, when red and blue were new and the code was still rough, this meant that using Ditto felt less like calling on a clever shapeshifter and more like juggling a fragile experiment. From a game design perspective, it never quite found its place. Too weak and unreliable for serious play, too odd and conditional for most casual players to truly trust, it lingered at the edges, a curiosity more than a companion. And so when you remember that Mew and Ditto share Transform, and perhaps a shade of color and curve of outline, another quiet question appears and refuses to leave. If Ditto was meant to echo Mew, why does it feel so underdeveloped, so punished by the very gimmick that defines it, as though the numbers themselves are hinting at an unfinished idea waiting in the space between them? Breeding grounds, daycare, eggs, and the Ditto paradox. And that unfinished idea lingers as the world of Pokémon quietly moves forward in time, into an era where something very different appears, not laboratories and broken notes, but a small house with a fenced yard, a gentle couple, and a sign that simply reads, Daycare. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to those early visits in Johto or Kanto remade, when you first left two partners there and walked away. The old man stepped outside, smiling, and told you they were getting along very well. You paced up and down the road, the music soft and repetitive, and when you returned, he pressed something into your hands. An egg. In that moment, the games quietly revealed that this world, beneath all the myths of gods and legends, also moves in small, domestic cycles of life. In ancient times, long before players spoke of stats and optimization, that discovery felt almost secret. Two Pokémon could share time together in that quiet yard, and from them a new life would appear, carrying moves from its parents, inheriting just enough to feel like a continuation of a story. But then another stranger discovery spread through schoolyards and early message boards. If one of those partners was Ditto, the other could be almost anyone. Ditto, who could already become anything in the moment, was now revealed as a kind of universal partner in the slow language of eggs. Male or female, rare or common, awkward egg group, or strange species that seemed lonely on their own. Paired with Ditto, they could all leave behind that same speckled shell. Mechanically, Ditto became a kind of gentle, all-purpose DNA, a soft solvent that let almost any form in this world mingle with another through time. And here, the echo of Mew grows louder. Mew is often described as the ancestor of all Pokémon, carrying within its tiny body the potential for every move, every shape, every future. Ditto, able to mix with almost any species in the daycare, feels like a quieter, humbler reflection of that idea, as if some residue of that primordial possibility had been left behind and given a name. Yet there is a paradox hiding in that kindness. This universal usefulness made Ditto beloved by collectors and by those who cared about hidden numbers and perfect lines of code. To this day, many players treasure a single Ditto more than almost any legendary, not for its personality, but for what it can produce when left alone behind that fence. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so linger for a moment on what that means. Ditto became essential, yet almost invisible, a background function rather than a character. Its role in breeding quietly reinforced the idea of leftover, unstable genetic material. Good for making more of others, but rarely invited to stand in the light itself. Think back across your own time with these games. How often did you bring Ditto with you into caves and forests, and how often did you leave it at the daycare, waiting, working in silence while you chased new legends elsewhere? In that gap between presence and absence, a deeper question begins to form about what it means in this world to be valued. Glitches, ghosts, and genetic scraps, the missing no era. And yet that question did not appear in a vacuum. It grew out of a particular moment in time when the world inside a tiny grey Game Boy cartridge felt larger and stranger than anything the manual admitted. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back there for a moment. The soft click of the power switch, the greenish glow of the screen, and a link cable curling between two devices like a quiet promise of shared secrets. In those late 90s days, the game did not end when you closed the system. It continued on the playground, in whispered stories about hidden islands, truck-bound legendaries, and Pokémon that only appeared if you pressed the right buttons at the right time. This wasn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, moving through a world where rumor and reality blurred, and where every strange flicker of pixels might be a doorway into a deeper myth. Into that atmosphere stepped Missing No, a non-name for a non-shape, a glitch that felt less like an error and more like a ghost in the machine. You might remember the jagged, broken sprite, the way the world seemed to shudder for a moment when you encountered it along a certain stretch of shoreline. The game stuttered, numbers twisted, and suddenly your inventory overflowed with impossible stacks of items that no one had intended you to have. To this day, Missing No feels like a quiet revelation about how fragile that digital world really was. Hall of Fame records warped into unreadable symbols, proud teams became corrupted echoes, and yet the cartridge still carried on as if acknowledging that even in this gentle adventure, the underlying code was stitched together with imperfect hands and limited memory. When you grew up inside that glitch-touched space, the idea of failed creations did not feel harsh. It felt natural, almost comforting. Broken sprites, invisible trainers, surfable statues, and duplicated rare candies all suggested that behind the smooth surface of the story there was a workshop full of scraps, experiments, and half-finished ideas that had somehow slipped into the light. In that context, Ditto's simple, formless body and single, peculiar move began to resemble those scraps, an amorphous pink shape, an identity that never quite belonged to itself, and transformed standing alone where other Pokémon had long lists of moves. Tonight we're drifting into the thought that Ditto looked less like a proud creature of nature and more like a leftover piece of code, a placeholder that someone forgot to remove. Fans, especially in those early internet years, started to braid two languages together, the language of cloning and DNA from Cinnabar's quiet journals, and the language of data and memory from Missing No's haunted shoreline. In that braid, Ditto sat perfectly, both genetic template and programming variable, a soft little glitch made flesh. And so Ditto becomes, in memory, both a biological mistake and a digital one, a small, smiling blob caught between story and software, suspended forever in that strange balance where errors become myths and leftover data learns to dream. The early internet whispers, how the theory took root. By the time players began whispering about Ditto as a mistake, the world around those whispers had already changed. The cartridges were the same, but the silence of single-player rooms was slowly giving way to the soft, stuttering song of dial-up, as if the game itself had learned to send its dreams through wires. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to those early fan-made spaces when Pokémon lived on bright backgrounds and crowded sidebars. You would step into simple forums with pale blue text or personal websites stitched together in basic HTML, their headers glowing with animated GIFs of spinning Pokeballs and flickering flames. It was a gentle, cluttered cosmos, hand-built by kids and teenagers who wanted the myths of Kanto to keep expanding long after the credits rolled. In that quiet digital dawn, small discoveries were treated like sacred artifacts. Someone would notice that Ditto and Mew shared transform, that they weighed the same, that their sprites seemed to echo each other in color and softness. They would post a short message on a forum or add a single line to a rumor page. Maybe Ditto is a failed Mew clone. Each time it was copied, pasted, and reposted, the idea gained a little more weight, as if repetition could carve it into the code of memory. Tonight we're drifting into those rumor lists and did you know Ush pages, where fact and headcanon lay side by side like fossils in the same ancient layer of stone. You might remember scrolling through long pages of secrets, how to reach hidden islands, how to awaken mysterious Pokémon, how to find Mew under a truck. Nestled among them were speculative essays, paragraphs of careful, almost scholarly writing that traced Ditto's appearance in Cinnabar Mansion, its strange breeding role, its shared move with Mew. They read like research papers, but they were really quiet love letters to a world people didn't want to stop exploring. Game Freak and Nintendo said very little. There were no official timelines, no firm denials, no detailed lore entries to close every gap. That silence left a wide, echoing space, and in that space, fans became gentle archivists and storytellers, weaving connective tissue where the official narrative ended. Not to punish, but to reset the limits of what the story could hold. Over time, the Ditto Mew theory became less about evidence and more about belonging. To believe it was to share a secret with strangers across continents, to feel that Kanto still had hidden depths waiting in the tall grass of memory. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, one who chooses the version of the story that makes the world feel deeper, kinder, more carefully balanced between science and myth. To this day, many players remember the theory not as speculation, but as something almost official, an unwritten rule of the Kanto experience passed down like an oral tradition. And as new generations arrived, bringing new regions, new legends, and new screens, that old whisper about Ditto and Mew followed quietly behind them, waiting for one more piece of evidence that seemed, at last, too perfect to ignore. Design on a deadline. How rushed Gen 1 shaped Ditto. And that whisper, that quiet rumor about Ditto and Mew, only becomes more intriguing when you remember how those first games were actually made. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to the world inside the cartridge just yet, but to the small, very human room where Kanto was first drawn in pixels and code, a tiny team, limited tools, and a deadline that kept moving closer like the tide. In ancient times for gaming, before generous memory and patches, Pokémon Red and Green were built under strict limits of time and space. Every creature, every cry, every line of text had to share a single, cramped home on that Game Boy cartridge. Ideas were added and removed, sprites were redrawn, and whole concepts were quietly set aside when they no longer fit. Many designs arrived late, sliding into the world of Kanto only after others had already been cut away. Because of this, the developers often had to compress their dreams. One sprite might be edited and repurposed, one concept might be trimmed, until only its simplest form remained. Missing number and other oddities are like fossils of that process, reminders that the code was once full of experiments and half-finished structures. The balance between ambition and limitation shaped everything, from the number of roots to the way a single move behaved. Within that context, Ditto begins to look less like a carefully sculpted character and more like a tool that happened to be left on the stage. Transform is a strange move. It copies another Pokemon's form, moves and stats, bending the rules of identity. It would be natural in that development environment to create a simple, shapeless test creature to make sure Transform worked correctly. A blob is easy to draw, easy to animate, and easy to store in memory. Then imagine the deadline approaching and that test creature being given a name, a Pokédex entry, and a place in the wild, not to punish, but to reset the project into something that could finally be finished. Ditto keeps its single move. It keeps its awkward stats, low and even, as if no one ever returned to polish them. Its design remains a soft, uneven shape with a simple face, especially in those early sprites, while other Pokémon receive horns, armor, legends, and myths. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you notice how quiet that feels. Ditto has no grand story in Kanto, no gym leader partner, no ancient temple. It simply appears in places like the Pokémon Mansion, as if it slipped in through a crack between experiments and finished features. To this day, its role as a universal breeding partner makes it feel more like a mechanic than a character, a system given a smile. In a world crafted with so much care, Ditto may be the visible seam, the place where you can still see the stitch of a rushed decision. Not a mistake in a cruel sense, but a gentle oversight that years later invited players to dream up their own missing story and to wonder what or who it was meant to mirror. Ditto in the mansion, coincidence or quiet confession? And nowhere is that missing story more quietly suggested than in a crumbling house on the edge of the sea. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to Cinnabar Island, to the Pokémon Mansion, standing half swallowed by nature and time. Inside, the tiles are cracked, the walls are scorched, and scattered among the debris are journals that turn this ruined place into the narrative heart of Kanto's experiments. July 10th, we discovered a new Pokémon Mew. February 6th, Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. On these yellowed pages, the myth of Mew steps out of legend and into a cold, fluorescent laboratory. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer wandering through dust and silence. In ancient times, you might imagine this mansion as a temple of science, where people reached toward the divine through genetics instead of prayer. Now it is quiet, haunted not by ghosts alone, but by the echo of choices made in the name of progress, not to punish, but to reset what humans thought they understood about power and creation. And there, among the grimer and coughing and restless fire types, you find Ditto. In red, blue, and yellow, this gentle, formless creature appears in the very same mansion that tells you, in plain words, where Mew and Mewtwo's story unfolded. Later, in some versions, Ditto can also be found in Cerulean Cave, that hidden pocket of the world where high-level, almost mythical Pokémon drift in the dark, and where Mewtwo itself waits at the farthest edge of your journey. To this day, players remember the feeling of stepping into those places and seeing Ditto listed alongside rare, powerful Pokémon. It does not roar, it does not glow, it simply wobbles and transforms, sharing Mew's strange, singular move. Transform in the wild, transform in the shadow of Mewtwo's origin, transform in the deepest cave of Kanto. For many, it felt less like a coincidence and more like a quiet confession, a hint that Ditto belonged to the same family of experiments, a failed echo of a perfect, elusive ancestor. Of course, there are gentler, more practical explanations. Perhaps Ditto was placed late in the game as a playful mechanic, a way for you to encounter, transform, and to copy your own team in a safe, experimental space. Maybe the designers simply wanted variety in these mysterious areas, a soft puzzle piece to support breeding later, a universal template with no deeper myth intended. From a development view, the choice could be entirely mundane. Yet the world of Pokémon has always invited you to read between the lines. By putting Ditto in the mansion, the games gave it a narrative context it otherwise lacked, letting fans stitch it into the story of Mew without needing any official decree. Tonight, we're drifting into that shared dream space between canon and interpretation, where a placement on a map becomes a memory, and a memory becomes a myth. Imagine now the mansion's basement, dim and quiet, long after the scientists have gone. The air is cool, the only sound a distant drip of water. In the corner, something small and pink slowly pulses in the dark, shapeless, yet waiting, like a forgotten thought. It does not move toward you. It simply exists, patient in the shadows, as if it is waiting to be noticed or remembered. Why Ditto feels like a design mistake. In that quiet basement with that small pink shape waiting in the dark, you can start to feel the strange emptiness around Ditto. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to a grand legend or an ancient god this time, but to a creature that seems to exist mostly as a mechanic, a tool tucked into the corners of the world. In actual play, Ditto's whole presence turns on a single idea: transform. Before it can mirror anything, it is fragile, slow and exposed, a soft target in the brief moment before it becomes something else. Even after it changes, it only copies what is already there, often with fewer resources, no held memories, no learned moves of its own. Where other Pokémon invite you to imagine strategies that grow over time, Ditto tends to offer the same quiet pattern, again and again, like a reflection that never quite becomes a person. This thinness continues outside of those moments of contact. To this day, Ditto has almost no personality in the games themselves. It does not receive a shrine like the lake spirits or a whispered tale like Darkrai. It rarely appears in cutscenes, has no dedicated myths, no village that speaks its name with reverence. It is present in the Pokédex, of course, but its entries describe a function more than a soul, a being that copies others so completely that nothing uniquely its own is left on the page. Then, in later generations, something subtle but important happens. Breeding arrives, and with it, a new role for Ditto. Suddenly this quiet, formless creature becomes a universal partner in the day care, able to pair with almost any species, turning into a kind of living template. Mechanically, this is helpful, even comforting, especially when you are searching for a particular nature or hidden ability. But each egg reinforces a gentle, unsettling idea. That Ditto exists mainly to serve other designs, to support the stories of everyone else. When you place these pieces together, the fragile mechanics, the minimal lore, the heavy utility, Ditto begins to feel less like a beloved partner and more like leftover scaffolding from the game's construction, a system made flesh. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, looking at a creature that seems to have slipped out of the developer's toolbox and into the tall grass. It works, it is useful, and yet it feels strangely unfinished. Of course, some players love Ditto precisely because of that weirdness, cherishing its lopsided smile, its soft, uncertain shape, its ability to become almost anything. That affection is real, but it is different from the careful, resonant design wrapped around Mew or Mewtwo, whose stories bend time and space and grief into deliberate myth. With Ditto, the warmth often feels like something fans have built themselves, filling a quiet space the game's left open, and so the Mew clone theory begins to look like more than a curiosity. It starts to feel like a gentle repair. By tying Ditto to Mew, players give it a past, a reason to haunt that mansion, a sadness that explains its formless life. In ancient times within the fandom, on old message boards and whispered playground conversations, this theory spread like a secret spell, not to punish, but to reset Ditto's place in the story. Yet there is one detail hidden in the games themselves that complicates this comforting answer. Narrative dead ends, a story that never quite starts. Because when you go looking for that answer in the games themselves, you mostly find something else. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine the great story moments of this world unfolding in quiet sequence. The awakening of Groudon and Kyogre, the summit meeting with Rayquaza, the frozen chambers of the Regis, the altar where you first glimpse Palkia or Dialga, bending time and space like a gentle tide. In all of these scenes, so full of myth and meaning, Ditto is almost never there. Generation after generation, as legends are given temples, ruins, and sacred lakes, Ditto drifts around the edges like a misplaced thought. You see it in caves, in the Pokémon Mansion, in the daycare fields, a soft, formless presence with no shrine, no elder telling its story, no mural painted in ancient stone. Unknown, for example, received the ruins of Alph, sliding puzzles, and strange radio signals that turned them into a living alphabet of mystery. Rotom found a haunted home in televisions, motors, and laboratories, its mischief woven into the quiet machinery of modern life. Ditto, by contrast, waits in the grass. Tonight we're drifting into that absence, that gentle silence, where a myth could have been. When Ditto does appear in a scripted way, it is usually as an obstacle or a small trick, a trainer's Pokémon that suddenly transforms into your own team, a patch of wild grass where every encounter mirrors what you bring, a daycare solution that quietly solves your breeding puzzles while you sleep. Its gift is extraordinary, yet it is treated as a mechanic more than a mystery, a tool more than a tale. There are small exceptions, and they are charming in their own way. In Alola, a string of Ditto disguised as townsfolk becomes a light-hearted side quest, each reveal played for a gentle smile rather than awe. In other regions, an NPC may mention a Ditto that cannot quite hold its shape, a passing curiosity in a larger story. These moments are warm, but they lean toward comedy, little winks from the developers, rather than invitations to contemplate what a creature of pure possibility might mean. To this day, that lack of narrative follow-through makes Ditto feel like an unanswered question the games quietly set down and never picked back up. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you notice the empty spaces, no ancient tablet describing a proto-Ditto, no modern professor devoting a chapter to its strange, universal genetics, no legendary scene where its mimicry restores balance, not to punish, but to reset a world out of harmony. In a series that so often returns to old ideas and redeems them with new lore, Ditto's continued place on the sidelines begins to feel deliberate, almost like an afterthought preserved in amber. And yet, if the story will not answer the question of what Ditto truly is, the code behind the story may offer a quieter kind of explanation. Anime echoes, Ditto on the screen, still searching for itself. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment, away from code and cartridges and into the quiet glow of an old television screen. Tonight, we're drifting into a different kind of evidence, not written in numbers or encounter tables, but in expressions, hesitations, and the soft uncertainty of a pink blob that wants to be everything and ends up a little less than what it copies. In the early anime, there is a small stage, a wooden floor, and a girl named Duplica who loves impressions. Her partner is a Ditto that can transform its body perfectly, stretching and reshaping into any Pokémon she calls for. Yet always the face is wrong. No matter how hard it tries, every imitation ends with those same tiny dot eyes and that same simple line of a mouth. The audience in the story laughs, the real Pokémon tilt their heads, and Duplica encourages Ditto gently, as if reassuring a shy actor who keeps missing their cue. The scene is played for light-hearted comedy, but beneath it, there is a quieter story. Ditto's transformations become little moments of insecurity, practice, and almost success, and for once, this strange creature has something like a personality beyond its move pool. You watch it squint in concentration, see it wobble as it holds a form, and you can feel that it wants to be correct, to be convincing, to be enough. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a small Pokémon trying to find its place in a world of clear identities. To this day, the anime never turns and whispers the word clone in Ditto's direction. There are no direct links to Cinnabar's ruined labs, no mentions of Mew or Mewtwo when Duplica's Ditto struggles with its imperfect face. And yet, the idea it leans into is hauntingly similar. Ditto as something that can never quite become what it imitates, always one step away from the real thing, a shadow of a possibility rather than the finished myth. For fans who already carry the Mew theory in the back of their minds, this episode feels like an echo. The show does not confirm a failed experiment, but it quietly harmonizes with that emotional core, the notion of a being born for transformation that never feels fully complete. In ancient times within this fictional world, legends spoke of perfect deities of time and space. Beside them, Ditto feels like the opposite, a creature defined by its almosts and maybes. Later, Ditto drifts through the anime and movies as a gentle gimmick in the background, a shopkeeper's assistant that turns into customers, a spy's tool that wears another trainer's shape, a comic reveal when an imitation's eyes give everything away. It supports other stories, but it is rarely the story. The mystery stays at the edges, never pulled into the center where Mew and Mewtwo once stood beneath stormy skies. You might wonder how different Ditto would feel if even one official tale had dared to place it in that room with broken test tubes and scattered notes to give it a single line in the larger myth of creation and catastrophe. As you drift towards sleep, hold that version in your mind, because the next part of our quiet journey will return from the screen to the code itself, where another kind of truth is still waiting to be read. Official silence. What Game Freak has and hasn't said. From that imagined scene of Ditto in the ruin lab, we return to something quieter, and perhaps a little colder, what the official stories actually say. Close your eyes, let your mind wander, not through broken glass and scattered notes now, but through pages of manuals, Pokédex entries, and careful interviews, where every word has been chosen and every silence has its own kind of weight. To this day, there is no line in any game, guide, or developer commentary that calmly declares Ditto is a failed clone of Mew. You can read the Cinnabar Mansion journals tracing the discovery of a new Pokémon, the birth of Mewtwo, the hints of cloning and catastrophe, and Ditto's name never appears. You can listen to creators speak about how Mew was hidden in the data, how Mewtwo was designed as its powerful counterpart, and again, the little pink shapeshifter is left entirely outside the official myth. Instead, Ditto's own entries stay simple, almost stubbornly so. They describe a Pokémon that can copy any opponent's appearance, that transforms its cellular structure, that sometimes gets the details wrong and ends up with a strange face or imperfect form. The story is always about the ability itself, about change and imitation in a general sense, never about an origin event, never about an experiment gone wrong in some forgotten corner of the world. Mew, by contrast, is wrapped in language about ancestry and possibility. It is said to contain the genetic code of all Pokémon, a gentle root at the beginning of so many branches. Mewtwo is framed as an artificial being, created by humans who reached too far into nature's mystery. In ancient times, that might have been told as a myth about hubris and balance, a warning whispered around campfires. Yet even in these tales of genes and cloning, of science brushing against something sacred, Ditto remains unspoken, like a word someone chooses not to say. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and in that softer journey you start to notice how often Game Freak allows certain questions to remain unanswered. Long before online theories, the games were already full of half-explained ruins, quiet temples, and strange machines humming in the background, inviting you to fill the space with your own gentle stories. The Ditto Mew idea fits perfectly into that design, close enough to the text to feel possible, far enough from confirmation to remain folklore. So the theory lives in a kind of liminal space hovering between code and canon. It is too carefully supported by shared moves, colors, and locations to be dismissed outright, yet too carefully ignored by official words to be embraced as truth. Tonight we're drifting into that in-between place, where a myth can pass from player to player like a whispered secret, not to punish, but to reset how you see a familiar shape. As you rest here, the next part of our quiet story will follow the trail the games do give us, not spoken lines of dialogue, but the data itself, where patterns sometimes say what characters never will. Lore that pushes back. Why the theory doesn't fully fit. And yet, even when the data seems to whisper, the world of Pokémon has its own quiet ways of pushing back. In grassy patches far from any ruined lab, Ditto appears with no Cinnabar shadow nearby. In grassy patches far from any ruined lab, in places where no journals speak of Mewtwo, the little pink shape is simply there, as if it belongs. In Johto, in Hoenn, in Sinnoh, and beyond, Ditto shows up again and again, woven into roots and habitats that have nothing to do with that lonely mansion by the sea. Time moves forward, new regions open like chapters in a long, gentle story, and still Ditto is present without any mention of new experiments or repeated cloning. If every Ditto were a scar from one failed project, the spread begins to feel strangely wide, almost like nature itself has accepted this form and carried it along. Tonight we're drifting into that uncertainty, where design and myth start to blur. Later generations introduce other users of transform, other shapeshifters, who borrow faces and forms without any link to Mew at all. Zorua and Zoroark weave illusions, Mimikyu hides beneath its cloth, and even Smeargle copies moves in its own peculiar way. Transform stops feeling like a sacred thread, binding only Mew and Ditto together, and starts to look more like a broader idea in this universe. The dream of becoming something else, shared by many. To this day, the official stories remain remarkably Isaac. Across remakes of Kanto, across expanded Pokédex entries and side games that love to revisit old mysteries, no character ever steps forward to hint, even softly, that Ditto is a failed echo of Mew. No researcher in a lab corner says, "We tried to recreate a myth, and this is what remained." The silence is almost deliberate, as though the creators are content to let the theory live in the space between players, rather than on the page. There is another, simpler possibility, and it is a gentle one. Perhaps Ditto was always meant to be exactly what you see, a soft, formless blob that can become anything, a playful embodiment of potential without a tragic origin. In ancient times, within this franchise's development, when sprites were small and memory was limited, a single, adaptable shape might have been a practical choice that later grew into a quiet symbol of flexibility and balance. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And dreamers know that not every shape needs a sorrowful past to matter. The Ditto Mew theory is beautifully compelling, but when you trace its edges against the wider law, you can feel the seams, the places where it does not quite fit. And yet the question lingers in the dark like a soft glow. If the story is not airtight, why does it still resonate so deeply? And what does that say about the way we look at mistakes in this ancient sleeping world of code and creatures? Between accident and intention, holding both truths at once. So here, in the soft middle of the story, we pause with that glow still hanging in the air, and we look back at the path that brought you here. You've traced the gentle outline of the Ditto Mew theory, the shared pink, formless bodies, the way both seem to hang at the edge of shape, the strange exclusivity of transform as their signature move, and those quiet encounters in the ruined mansion where experiments on Mew once took place. You've wandered through fan memories of early internet myths, message boards and playground whispers, where people compared sprites and breeding quirks, noticing how Ditto could pair with almost anything, as if it were a universal template left behind in the code. You've also stepped carefully through the counterweights, the encounter data that doesn't quite line up, the way Ditto appears in places far from Cinnabar, the lack of any clear line in a Pokédex entry or developer interview that simply says, yes, this is Mew's failed echo. Around those facts, another layer has formed, the broader sense that the first games were built in limited time and limited space, full of missing no-era strangeness, cut ideas, and simple shapes that solved simple design needs. Ditto, with its awkward stats and one lonely move, fits that world of compromise. It feels like a tool as much as a creature, a way to let you see any Pokémon mirrored back at you without needing a whole new system. Tonight, we're drifting into a gentler idea that sits between certainty and doubt. In many creative worlds, there are what artists sometimes call happy accidents, moments where something unplanned slips through and later gathers meaning because people care enough to notice it. A stray brush stroke becomes a mountain, a glitch becomes a secret door, a blob of code becomes a myth. Ditto may be one of these. A mechanically clumsy, narratively thin Pokémon that players, over time, wrapped in a warmer story than the developers ever wrote down. To this day, people still point to its transform, its color, its mansion hauntings, and say, this is the failed clone of Mew, even if the official world never quite confirms it. The game offers a quiet shape. The community pours a legend into it. And in that there is a kind of poetic balance. Ditto is nothing on its own but potential, a soft outline waiting to be filled. It only becomes something more when it has something else to copy. In the same way, this supposed design mistake, this odd little placeholder, becomes meaningful only when your imagination presses against it, like Mew's shadow, falling over that simple smile. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. Hold both truths at once, as gently as you might hold an ancient shell found on a quiet shore. Ditto can be a rushed solution in an old game's code, a failed echo of Mew's DNA, and a beloved myth born from years of dreaming. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And in the next stretch of this story, we'll follow that dream a little further into what it means for a world to remember its own mistakes. The mansion's silent witnesses. Logs, ash, and unasked questions. So, if Ditto is a dream made from mistakes, the question becomes, where in the story could those mistakes have happened? Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to Cinnabar Island, to that crumbling Pokémon Mansion where the game itself leaves you a trail of quiet, burned pages to follow. You walk those ruined halls in your memory, and the logs begin to surface. One entry, written in a careful hand, speaks of a distant jungle and the discovery of a new Pokémon Mew, a creature so rare and gentle it feels more like a myth than a specimen. Time passes in a turn of the page and another note appears, dated, almost clinical. July 10th. We discovered Mew, July 5th, Guyana, South America. The world widens for a moment, then narrows again into glass and metal. Further in, another diary flickers into focus. February 6th, Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. There is a strange, quiet weight to that line. A legendary moment, recorded like a lab result. And then, as you drift through the remaining scraps, the tone darkens. Mewtwo grows stronger. Mewtwo grows uncontrollable. The final entries hint at fear, at something breaking free at the mansion's end. Tonight we're drifting into those lines, but also into the spaces between them. Because for all that the journals tell you, Mew's discovery, Mewtwo's birth, the growing danger, they are just as loud in what they refuse to say. There is no mention of failed clones, no mention of half-formed beings, no notes about strange, amorphous Pokémon that melted back into formlessness when the experiment went wrong. In ancient times, myths were often carried in what the storytellers left unsaid, and the same feeling lingers here. You are invited to imagine the missing pages, experiments that did not last long enough to earn a date, prototypes that dissolved before they could be named, test subjects deemed too unstable or too unimportant to deserve a line of ink. The world of that mansion was one of tanks and samples and careful measurements, but you can sense that not every outcome made it into the official record. Now picture the mansion as it is when you explore it in the game. Burnt paper crumbles underfoot. Cracked glass tanks stand empty, their metal frames rusted and leaning. Cages hang open on broken hinges, swaying slightly in the sea breeze that slips through shattered windows. In the quiet, something small and pink might be moving at the edge of your vision, flowing under a fallen door, pooling in the shadow of a ruined machine. That is where Ditto could live, not in a confirmed entry, but in the gaps, like a ghost of an experiment the story chose not to acknowledge. A universal template wandering the ruins, able to become anything yet belonging nowhere, a soft echo of Mew's shape and power that never quite resolved into a name on a journal page. To this day, the official lore leaves those lines unwritten, and sometimes the most interesting parts of a story are the ones the records leave out. As you drift deeper into sleep, we'll follow those unofficial currents next, the fan-made myths and quiet theories that try to fill in what the mansion's ash can no longer say. When fans became archaeologists, early internet Mew hunters, and so the gaps left by the mansion's ash were quietly adopted by someone else, the children and teenagers huddled over keyboards and cartridges, trying to read between the pixels. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to that world for a moment, to a time when the internet hummed through dial-up tones and every web page felt like a secret room you had somehow stumbled into. In those early days, information did not arrive all at once. It trickled. A playground whisper here, a half-loaded fan page there, a message board post that took a full minute to appear on a CRT screen. You might hear from a friend of a friend that their cousin had caught Mew by sailing around the SS, Anne, or by pushing a truck that sat in the quiet space near the harbour, as if the ship itself were guarding a myth. This wasn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, following rumours instead of maps. Players tried everything. They walked in careful patterns through tall grass, counted steps, reset their games under certain moons in the real-world sky, and performed strange little rituals in front of that truck, convinced that if they were patient enough, the code would reveal its gentlest secret. Glitch methods, missing no encounters, and half-understood Game Shark codes all blurred into a kind of digital treasure hunt where the prize was not power but proof that Mew was truly there. In this soft, uncertain landscape, Ditto began to feel like a clue. It was common, almost forgettable, and yet it knew Transform, a move so unusual and so complete that it felt like something reserved for legends. When players noticed that Mew shared that same move, and that both were small, pink, and strangely formless in certain sprites, a quiet suspicion took root. Ditto stopped being just a blob. It became a question mark. Screenshots started to circulate. Side-by-side comparisons of Mew and Ditto, grainy photos of old Game Boy screens captured with disposable cameras, and fan-made guides hosted on simple, starry background websites. Some pointed to Cinnabar Mansion, where Ditto wandered the ruined halls as if it had slipped out of the abandoned experiments themselves. Others whispered that Ditto's ability to pair with almost any Pokémon in the daycare made it feel like a universal template, a leftover piece of genetic clay. To this day, those guides and rumor posts read less like instructions and more like campfire tales written in HTML. Kids stayed up late, the glow of the monitor or the Game Boy screen the only light in the room, trading theories about failed Mew clones and discarded prototypes. In those quiet hours, the Mew-Ditto story felt real not because of evidence but because so many people chose to dream it together. Tonight we're drifting into that shared dreaming where community becomes author. In this sense, the Mew-Ditto theory is as much a gentle folk myth as it is a reading of game design, a way the early internet found balance between what was coded and what was imagined. From here, we can move from rumor to pattern and look more closely at the tiny design choices that kept this story alive. Transform as a mirror, Mew's freedom, Ditto's limitation. From here, that pattern becomes clearest in a single, quiet move that both Mew and Ditto share, as if they are holding opposite sides of the same mirror. Transform, a simple word for something strangely profound, the ability to copy another Pokémon's form, their stats, even their moves, but only for a little while, like borrowing a mask until the moment passes. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and picture Mew using Transform. In ancient times, if someone had seen this small, cat-like creature shimmering and reshaping itself, they might have told a myth about a spirit of possibility, a being of pure curiosity trying on the world. For Mew, Transform feels like an expression of freedom. It already carries, in the games, a vast move pool, almost every technique you can imagine, tucked away inside its gentle, playful body. When it changes shape, it is not out of need, but out of wonder. You can imagine Mew drifting through time and space, folding itself into the silhouettes of those it meets, not to deceive, but to understand, to share in their experience for a moment. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a soft godling treating reality like watercolor, blending edges, testing where one life ends and another begins. Transform for Mew is a toy, an extra brush in an already overflowing paint box. Ditto, though, stands on the other side of that mirror. Where Mew's identity is larger than Transform, Ditto's is almost nothing but. Its entire design, from its simple face to its neutral, blobby body, seems to exist only so it can become something else. In the games, it has no real moves of its own beyond Transform, and its natural stats leave it fragile, waiting for a safe moment just to copy another presence and hope that is enough. Tonight, we're drifting into that contrast. Mew chooses to become, Ditto must become. For Mew, changing shape is play. For Ditto, it is survival, the only way it can truly participate in the world around it. Transform becomes a crutch, a single, narrow bridge over a deep emptiness, suggesting a story of a creature that never fully became itself because there was never a self to return to. If you hold the Mew Ditto theory in your hands very gently, another image appears. If Ditto truly were a failed Mew clone, then Transform might be the only shard of Mew's divinity that survived the process, a lone spark of godlike potential floating in an otherwise broken vessel. Everything else, Mew's strength, its vast move pool, its playful grace, falls away, and what remains is this one inherited instinct, becomes someone, anyone else. To this day, that idea carries a quiet sadness. Sometimes in stories and in life, having only one way to be can feel like a small, constant tragedy, a soft ache rather than an open wound. And as we move deeper into Ditto's role in this world, we'll see that the places it appears and the tasks it's given only deepen that ache in ways the games never quite say aloud. The numbers. Beneath the myth, stats that don't quite add up. And when you look closely at Ditto, that ache becomes a little clearer in the numbers hidden underneath its soft, simple shape. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment to the quiet machinery beneath the world of Pokémon, the part you never see on the screen. Every creature you meet carries a small constellation of values called base stats, silent numbers that decide how strong a blow will land, how quickly a move will come out, how sturdily a body will endure. You never hear them spoken in the story, yet they guide everything, like currents under calm water. Tonight we're drifting into those currents for Mew and Ditto, not to measure them as competitors, but to understand what the designers might have been whispering through math. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer tracing patterns in the dark. Mew, in those original games, is almost perfectly balanced. Its base stats form a neat little circle. 100 in every category, no weakness, no glaring strength, simply complete. It is fast enough to move first, sturdy enough to endure, strong enough in both mind and body to use almost any move well. In the story, Mew is a mythical ancestor, a kind of genetic memory of the Pokémon world itself, and its numbers reflect that idea. Flexible, symmetrical, capable of becoming anything you teach it to be. Ditto, by contrast, lives at the other end of that quiet spectrum. Its base stats are low across the board, with no hidden spike of power, no secret reservoir of speed or resilience. In the original games, before abilities and held items softened the edges, Ditto was fragile, often fainting before it could even finish its single-party trick. Without Transform, it is almost nothing. With Transform, it only ever becomes an echo of something else. If Ditto were truly a failed clone of Mew, some people imagine the numbers might carry a warped reflection of that perfection, like a shattered mirror still hinting at the original face. Perhaps a few stats might remain high, or the total might sit just below Mew's, close enough to feel related, yet broken. Instead, Ditto's spread feels more like a generic, low-tier creature, designed not as a fallen god, but as a mechanical tool. To this day, that mismatch is one of the reasons some fans and analysts see Ditto less as a carefully placed narrative piece and more as a late design patch, a way to solve breeding and transform mechanics rather than to deepen an ancient myth. The lore whispers one thing, the numbers murmur another. And yet, numbers do not always hold the whole story. They draw outlines, they suggest balance and imbalance, but they leave space for wonder, for headcanons, for the soft comfort of believing in a secret connection the data does not quite confirm. In the next part of our quiet journey, we'll step away from pure arithmetic and return to places and journals to see how the world itself tries to answer the question the stats leave open. Breeding grounds and hidden patterns. Ditto's strange role in reproduction. So we leave the numbers behind and drift back into something softer, the quiet routines of this world, the way new life arrives when you are not looking. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to a small, fenced-in patch of grass beside a simple house, somewhere between towns where an old couple watches over other people's partners. From Generation 2 onward, you are told that if you leave 2 compatible Pokémon at this daycare and give them time and space, something gentle may happen. You walk away, you explore. You sleep in a Pokémon Center bed, and when you return, the old man sometimes steps forward with a small surprise. An egg. No ceremony, no mythic light, just a quiet promise of a new story waiting to hatch in your hands. In that system, most pairs follow rules: species, egg groups, genders, careful categories that suggest an unseen biology at work. But then there is Ditto, sitting calmly outside those patterns like a smudge on a careful chart. Ditto can pair with almost anything that can breed, regardless of gender, regardless of egg group, becoming a kind of universal partner, a biological wildcard that the world itself seems strangely willing to accept. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, so you can let yourself imagine what that means. If Mew is said, in stories and Pokédex whispers, to hold the genetic code of all Pokémon, then a broken echo of Mew that can reproduce with nearly any species feels almost too fitting. Ditto, the imperfect copy, becomes a diluted reflection of that universal DNA, not shaping the world like a creator, but quietly mirroring it in every egg it helps bring forth. To this day, players use Ditto as an invisible foundation for entire living collections, carefully bred teams, rows of shinies, boxes of dream partners waiting to be trained. Yet when you look at Ditto itself, it remains almost characterless, a featureless face and a single move, transform, echoing Mew's own signature trick. It is as if the myth leaked into the mechanics, leaving behind a soft outline of the Mew theory every time an egg appears. And still, if you step back from the myth and think about design, another picture comes into focus. Perhaps Ditto's role was chosen not as secret lore, but as a practical kindness. One Pokémon that could help you hatch almost anything, smoothing out the rough edges of collecting, turning breeding from a puzzle of rare pairs into something more accessible. A convenient solution wrapped in a mysterious, formless body. Tonight we're drifting into that tension between story and system. Because while this breeding role makes Ditto mechanically important, almost sacred in the daily rhythm of the game, it does not explain why its presence in the wider world feels so strangely empty. In ancient times, myths grew around beings that shaped mountains and oceans. Ditto shapes only data, then disappears. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow that emptiness and see how Ditto's design begins to look less like a hidden legend and more like a narrative dead end that the world itself quietly stepped around. Where Ditto lives, caves, labs, and the geography of a rumor. That emptiness doesn't just live in Ditto's design, it lives in the places you find it. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to Kanto's map, not as a grid of tiles and encounters, but as a quiet world laid out like a story, where each patch of grass and each dark corridor is a sentence the game whispers instead of speaks. In red, blue, and yellow, Ditto does not drift through the early routes with Pidgey and Rattata. It waits. You meet it on Cinnabar Island, inside the ruined Pokémon Mansion, where the air feels heavy with ash and memory. Tonight, we're drifting into those broken hallways where journal pages talk about Mew, about a newborn called Mewtwo, about experiments that changed the balance of nature and mind. And in those same rooms, among the debris and the wild growlithe and coughing, a small pink shape appears, ready to become anything but itself. The game never tells you that Ditto came from those experiments, never says the word clone, never links the transform you see in battle to the scientific hubris described in the notes. Yet to this day, many players remember the first time they met Ditto there and felt, without proof, that they had stumbled onto leftover attempts, discarded prototypes that somehow slipped free into the wider world. The mansion's silence makes that feeling stronger. The story is implied, not written. Outside the mansion, Ditto's trail continues in places that feel just as strange. Along the coast near Cinnabar, in the sea foam-adjacent routes, and deep within Cerulean Cave, Ditto appears again, tucked among high-level Pokémon and rare encounters. Cerulean Cave, in particular, with its late-game guardians like Mewtwo, feels less like a simple dungeon and more like a sealed wound in the world's geography, a place the story tries to hide at the very edge of your journey. Finding Ditto there makes it feel out of place, almost like a glitch that learned how to live. In contrast, Mew is almost never there at all. In ancient times, within the series' own myth, Mew is spoken of as the ancestor of Pokémon, a gentle origin point of possibility. But in the games themselves, Mew is absent from normal play, locked behind special events, rumors, and glitches beneath trucks and inside cables. You cannot simply walk into tall grass and meet it. Instead, what you meet again and again is Ditto, a small echo of that missing mythical presence. Maybe these placements were coincidences or just decisions made for balance and variety. Yet to a player's imagination they connect like dots on an unseen map, a quiet trail of evidence pointing back toward failed experiments and secrets the world never fully explains. In a world designed tile by tile where you meet a Pokémon can feel like part of its myth, even when the developers never put that story into words. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and the next step is to look not just at where Ditto lives, but how it behaves when it finally appears before you. Glitches, ghost data, and the era of missing no. So when Ditto finally appears before you, it does so in a world that is already a little unstable, a little dreamlike at the edges. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to those first journeys through Kanto, where the screen flickered, numbers behaved strangely, and the game itself seemed to whisper that there was more hidden just beyond what you were meant to see. To this day, the original games feel like a quiet myth about unfinished code. Missing No waits on the shoreline beside Cinnabar, a scrambled shape that bends time and space around your items. A single encounter can turn one rare candy into hundreds, or twist your Hall of Fame into a gallery of corrupted, half-remembered champions. Sprites break apart, names overflow their borders, and suddenly the neat little world of routes and towns feels haunted by data that almost became something real. In that era, every glitch felt like a ghost story. You walk along the edge of the map, surf where you were not exactly intended to surf, and the world answers with creatures made of noise and numbers. It is as if there are Pokémon that nearly existed, ideas that lived for a moment in the memory of the cartridge before dissolving back into static. The game becomes an ancient ruin of code where you explore not just forests and caves, but the forgotten corners of its programming. Tonight, we're drifting into that strange, liminal Kanto because Ditto belongs there in a way that feels almost too fitting. A simple pink shape, 2 dots for eyes, a soft curve for a mouth, it looks less like a creature from nature and more like something that never quite finished loading. Its entire story and gameplay is to become something else, to overwrite itself with the form and moves of whatever stands in front of it. It is legitimate, catchable, recorded in the Pokédex, and yet it carries the flavor of a mistake that was gently invited into canon. Players quickly learn that Ditto behaves oddly at the edges of what the game can handle. Transform interacting with another transform can lead to looping identities, copied stats, and strange timing. In certain glitch setups, a Ditto that has transformed into a specific Pokémon can influence what appears later, hinting that under the surface, the game is constantly rewriting who and what Ditto is allowed to be. It is as if the cartridge itself keeps asking over and over what Ditto really is in a world where missing no can stand beside the sea and quietly rewrite your inventory. The idea of a failed Mew clone wandering the ruins of Cinnabar's lab does not feel far-fetched. The rough edges of Kanto make the Mew theory feel less like wild speculation and more like a natural extension of a game that wears its seams in plain sight. And as you drift deeper into this story, another thought appears. If the same hurried development that left glitches and ghosts in the code also shaped Ditto, then perhaps this little blob is not just thematically strange, but a design that was never fully allowed to become itself. The next step is to look at how that hurried creation might have left Ditto feeling, in some quiet ways, like a mistake. Rushed dreams. How Generation 1's development shaped Ditto. In a way, to understand why Ditto feels unfinished, you have to step back from the creature itself and look at the tiny world it was born into. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that first Game Boy screen, a small window of light in a dark room trying to contain an entire region, hundreds of creatures, and a quiet sense of adventure in just a few fragile megabytes. The original games were not crafted with endless space and modern tools, but with strict limits pressing in from every side. The cartridge could only hold so much. The team at Game Freak was small, tired, and learning as they went, trying to fit an entire living world into a device meant for brief moments on a train. Every town, every cry, every sprite had to earn its place, because memory was not a gentle ocean then, but a narrow river. In such a narrow river, reuse was not a shortcut so much as a necessity. Sprites were mirrored, ideas were simplified, and many designs had to serve more than one quiet purpose. A single tile set might become several different routes. A simple mechanic could be stretched into an entire story. This wasn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer trying to make a myth feel real with almost nothing to work with. Within that constraint, Ditto begins to look less like a deliberate mystery and more like a tool that happened to be given a name. One amorphous sprite, one move, transform, and suddenly you have late-game variety without drawing dozens of new forms. Later, that same idea becomes a breeding shortcut, a universal partner who can stand in for almost any species, a soft piece of glue holding the daycare together. One design, many roles, very little extra space. In that light, the lack of deep narrative around Ditto feels less surprising. When you are struggling just to make link cables work and to keep the game from collapsing under its own code, weaving an elaborate myth for every creature is a luxury. To this day, many Generation 1 Pokémon exist almost entirely as silhouettes and Pokédex lines, their deeper stories implied rather than stated, their mysteries born from what had to be left unsaid. So Ditto's strange suggestive qualities, the blank eyes, the formless body, the way it becomes everything and yet remains no one, may not have been planted as careful lore seeds at all. They might simply be the shadows cast by design shortcuts, patterns of necessity that players later read as myth. And when you sense Ditto as a mistake, it is not that it should never have existed, but that its mechanics and your dreams outgrew the quiet, utilitarian role it was made for. Tonight we're drifting into a gentler understanding. Many of the quirks you love from that ancient Kanto, from missing no to glitched cries and haunted mansions, were born from the same hurried, imperfect process. The next question is how that process, and all those limitations, shaped the way Ditto feels in your hands and in the story of Mew. Design without a destiny. Ditto as a narrative dead end, and that is where Ditto begins to feel strangely hollow, like a shape cut out of the world that was never quite filled in. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you might notice that even in that ancient Kanto, most creatures around it slowly gathered stories like moss on stone, while Ditto stayed almost perfectly smooth. Many of the simplest partners you met in those first games were given a kind of quiet identity. Pidgey was the gentle bird of every roadside morning. Kadabra carried spoons and strange rumors of once being human. Cubone wore its mother's skull, and the Pokédex whispered about grief in a way that stayed with you. Even something as small as Magikarp was framed as a joke that would, in time, become a myth of perseverance. They were not just numbers, they were tiny myths. Ditto, by contrast, was almost entirely defined by a single idea: transform. Its Pokédex entries, from red and blue onward, mostly circle that same description, like a tide that never quite reaches the shore. It can copy another Pokémon's appearance. It can imitate cells. It can fail if it loses focus. Generation after generation, the language changes slightly, but the story never deepens into an origin, a relationship, or a place in culture. There is no village that reveres Ditto, no ancient text that fears it, no legend that needs it for balance. To this day, when you read its entries across regions, you find only variations on a theme: a body like soft clay, a talent for mimicry, a few gentle notes about imperfect copies. Nothing about Cinnabar, nothing about Mew, nothing about why a creature with such strange, almost cosmic flexibility exists at all in a world so full of purpose. Into that quiet, fans poured their own meaning. They noticed that Ditto and Mew alone shared Transform as their natural move in Generation 1. They saw the similar pink, the rounded, formless sprites, the way both seemed like distilled possibility. They walked the ruined halls of the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, read about Mewtwo's creation, and met wild Ditto in the very same place. Out of these echoes, they built myths of failed clones, discarded experiments, and lonely blobs of almost Mew wandering the world. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and from that dreaming came elaborate stories. Ditto as the forgotten sibling of Mewtwo, Ditto as the residue left behind whenever Mew was copied, Ditto as a living reminder of human hubris. The games, however, stayed almost completely silent. No NPC wonders about Ditto, no journal mentions it, no later region reaches back to tie a ribbon around this strange, malleable creature. That gap between fan-created meaning and official quiet can make Ditto feel like a narrative dead end, a question the canon never chooses to answer. It is not that Ditto should not exist, rather it was introduced with mechanics and placement that seemed to beg for a story, and then left without one, suspended in empty space. Tonight we're drifting into a gentler examination of that emptiness, because the next step is to see how, even as players wove the Mew clone theory into a comforting myth, the official lore quietly pushed back, leaving Ditto's soft, unfinished mystery resting in your hands. Canon speaks softly. Official lore that breaks the clone. Theory. So now, with that soft, unfinished mystery resting in your hands, you can close your eyes and let your mind wander towards something quieter. What the world of Pokémon itself actually says. Not the theories, not the message boards, but the words that live inside the games, humming gently beneath the music. In ancient times of your own memory, maybe you read a Pokédex entry, half awake, not quite noticing its implications. Ditto across region after region is described not as an experiment, but as a species that simply exists. It is found in caves, in grass, in city outskirts, living among other Pokémon as if it has always been there, part of nature's strange balance. There is no line about Cinnabar's labs, no hint of broken test tubes or failed cloning tanks, only a quiet assertion. This is a Pokémon you can meet in the wild, like any other. Those entries linger on its quirks instead of its origin. They tell you Ditto struggles to maintain a form, that it reverts when it laughs, when it's distracted, when its concentration slips for just a moment. The story is not of tragedy, but of imperfection, of a gentle mimic who can almost become anything, yet never entirely hold the shape. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, a little being trying on identities the way you try on dreams before sleep. The anime and side stories echo this same simple melody. Ditto appears as a companion to a wandering trainer, or as a wild Pokémon in a forest, or as a shy performer on a small stage. Its transformations a source of quiet comedy rather than cosmic horror. Nowhere does the camera pan back to reveal Cinnabar's ruins behind it. Nowhere does a character whisper that this is the remnant of Mewtwo's creation. To this day, Ditto in these stories belongs to the living world, not to a laboratory's past. Contrast that with Mewtwo, whose origin the canon repeats like a solemn myth. Journal entries in the mansion, opening scenes in movies, dialogue in later games, all of them insist that Mewtwo was made by human hands, a clone born from Mew's DNA, torn from nature and placed in glass. Other artificial Pokémon share this clarity. Porygon is called man-made. Type: Null is described as a constructed chimera. When the series wants you to know something was created, it steps forward and says so. And yet for Ditto, it never does. The silence becomes its own kind of statement. If Ditto is not a failed Mew clone in the official story, then why does it still feel like a mistake, a soft glitch in the fabric of this ancient, dreaming world? Tonight we're drifting into that question next, and into what it reveals about the stories you bring with you every time you press start. Why the clone? Story doesn't fit. Holes in the Ditto Mew narrative. So to move gently forward, we need to place the theory itself on the table, like a quiet artifact in a museum of stories. The claim is simple and strangely elegant. Ditto, the little pink shapeshifter, is said to be a failed attempt to clone Mew, created during the same secret experiments on Cinnabar Island that eventually gave the world Mewtwo. It feels tidy, it feels like balance, but when you look closely, the edges begin to blur. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that ruined mansion on Cinnabar, its notes about Mew, about a newborn creature called Mewtwo, about dates and failures and progress. The myth says that in those missing lines between journal entries, Ditto was born and discarded, a soft echo of perfection. Yet if Ditto truly began there, in one hidden lab on one lonely island, how did it come to drift so widely through the world, appearing in far-off regions, in quiet grass and caves, long after Cinnabar's research has crumbled into memory? In ancient times, within the series' own timeline, there is no mention of Cinnabar at all, and yet Ditto still appears in later games set in places that never even whisper the island's name. You meet Ditto in Johto's roots, in Unova's plains, in Kalus's gentle fields, as if it were simply another piece of nature, wandering through space and time without a scientist's hand guiding it. The further you travel from Kanto, the more this single laboratory origin begins to feel like a story trying to stretch farther than it was meant to go. There is also the quiet weight of what is not said. Those Cinnabar journals speak clearly about Mew, about the creation of Mewtwo, about the ethics of pushing life too far. To this day, in remakes and sequels, in expanded lore and revisited ruins, no researcher ever pauses to mention a strange, jelly-like failure that can become anything but never quite be itself. The silence is almost too complete, as if the world itself has never heard the rumor you carry. And when Game Freak wishes to tell you that something is artificial, they do not whisper. Porygon is described openly as a man-made Pokémon. Type: Null and Silvally are framed as deliberate constructs born from experimentation. Genesect is an ancient creature reshaped by human hands, its story written directly into the text. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. And even from that dreaming distance, you can feel the pattern. When an origin is meant to be known, it is named. So the Ditto Mew theory rests in a softer place, not quite canon, not quite discarded. It survives because it is emotionally satisfying, because it turns a simple blob into a quiet tragedy and gives Mew's myth another layer of melancholy. Tonight we're drifting into that space between code and canon, where fan-made stories linger, and we'll see what Ditto reveals about the way you mend the gaps the official world leaves open, the emotional truth of a false theory. In that in-between place, you can start to notice something gentle and important. There is a difference between what is factually true and what is emotionally true. Canon is made of dates, locations, sprites, and journal entries in the Pokémon Mansion. Emotional truth is softer. It lives in the way a story makes your chest ache a little, even when you know the details do not quite line up. Close your eyes and let your mind wander. Imagine Ditto not as a mechanic, not as a tool for breeding any partner you need, but as a failed echo of Mew left behind in the ruins of an experiment. Factually, the games never say this, yet when you see Ditto and Mew sharing Transform as their single, strange signature move, when you notice the similar pink, the rounded, almost formless shapes, your mind begins to knit a quiet myth in the empty space. In that myth, Ditto stops being a joke Pokémon. It is no longer just the blob you catch on Route 13 or in the wild grass, only to store in a box and forget. Instead, it becomes quietly tragic, a being that almost became something miraculous, the ancestor of all Pokémon, but never quite made it. It can become anything, and yet it is never allowed to simply be itself. There is something tender and a little sad in that. Tonight we're drifting into that sadness because it mirrors something very human. When the official story leaves blank space around a creature, you start to fill it with your own reflections. You might remember times you felt like a draft of a person, not the final version, like you were made to adapt to everyone else's expectations, shifting shape so others would be comfortable while your own outline stayed blurry. Ditto, with its empty eyes and permanent half-smile, becomes a mirror for those feelings of failure, imperfection, or being overlooked. To this day, the Mew-Ditto theory endures not because it is well supported by lore, but because it gives Ditto a place in the grand story of Mew and Mewtwo. Instead of floating at the edges of the world as a convenient mechanic, it is pulled into the center, into the laboratories of Cinnabar, into the same time and space as the journals that whisper about a new Pokémon Mewtwo. The theory invites you to imagine that some of those unnamed experiments did not vanish. They simply walked out into the tall grass and kept existing. Fan theories like this can feel like lullabies for the imagination, humming softly in the background while you sleep. You know they are not literally true, yet repeating them is soothing. They restore a sense of balance by giving lonely designs a purpose, by weaving forgotten creatures back into the myth. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and in dreams, even discarded ideas can find a gentle home. And still, underneath the comfort of the theory, something remains, the sense that Ditto itself feels like a mistake in the design of this world. Not just a failed Mew, but a strange, leftover piece of code and concept. In the next moments, we'll leave fan stories behind and look at Ditto on its own terms to see why, canon or not, it still sits so awkwardly between wonder and error. A mistake in balance, Ditto's awkward place in battle. So imagine you finally catch a Ditto after hearing the quiet playground myth that it can become anything. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to that small, glowing screen, to that gentle, pixelated world where possibilities seemed endless. You send Ditto out expecting wonder, expecting power, expecting the myth to come alive. Instead, in those original games, Ditto has to wait. It appears as a small, smiling blob, and on that first turn it can only do one thing: transform. Your opponent moves first, or maybe second, but either way, Ditto must endure a moment of pure vulnerability. No copied moves yet, no mirrored strength, just its own fragile self, hoping to stay in balance long enough to become something else. When transform finally takes hold, Ditto becomes a reflection of whatever stands before it. Same moves, same type, same stat stages. If the other creature has quietly raised its power or wrapped itself in protective screens, Ditto inherits that too. But underneath the perfect copy, one thing never changes: Ditto's own low P. It wears another's shape, yet its heart remains small. A borrowed legend with a paper-thin core. This makes Ditto feel unreliable in ordinary play. You can sense the idea is beautiful, an all-copying being of pure potential, but in practice it often faints in a single turn or arrives too late to matter. For a younger you, perhaps, this mismatch could feel almost like a broken promise. The strange, rare Pokémon that could become anything instead becomes a quiet disappointment, a curiosity you keep in the PC rather than a companion you trust. Tonight, we're drifting into that gap between promise and execution. Game Freak would later try to mend it. In newer generations, Ditto can be born with an ability called Imposter, transforming the instant it appears, skipping that dangerous first turn entirely. Suddenly the concept and the mechanics draw closer together, and Ditto begins to feel like the trickster you imagined all along. But that gentle correction arrived many years after Ditto first slipped into the world. To this day, that long delay leaves a faint echo. An ancient design, an ancient mistake, carried forward. You have a creature whose story suggests infinite forms, yet whose earliest reality was awkward, weak, and often frustrating to use. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and the dream does not quite match the waking world. It is easy, then, to see how the Mew theory became a kind of repair. If Ditto feels disappointing in play, the imagination reaches for a grander myth, a failed clone of Mew, a discarded echo of perfection, lingering in labs and caves. Mechanical frustration turns into quiet tragedy, and a clumsy design becomes a sorrowful story about experiments and loss, not to punish, but to reset how we feel about this little blob. Ditto's awkward place in these early games is only one layer of why it feels like a mistake. Beneath the numbers and turns, there are still its strange colors, its vacant smile, its shared shadow with Mew. In the next moments, we'll leave mechanics behind and drift further into those narrative and aesthetic mysteries to see how a shapeless creature came to hold so much hidden grief. A shape without a story, the cost of simplicity. So now, as the numbers fade into the background, you can turn your attention to that little blob itself and really see it. Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment. Ditto is not grand, not ornate. It is a small pink shape, almost like a drop of soft clay set down and forgotten, with two dark dots for eyes and a simple, wavering line for a mouth. It looks less like a creature from an ancient world and more like the first sketch of one, the kind of drawing you might make absent-mindedly in the corner of a notebook. No claws, no markings, no visible bones or muscles beneath the surface. Just a rounded, wobbly outline as if someone pressed their thumb into space and left a gentle smudge behind. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and in that dream, Ditto feels almost like a placeholder where a story should be. Now hold that image beside Mew. Mew is also pink, also simple, but its design bends in the opposite direction. Its eyes are large and expressive, always catching some invisible light. Its body is curled in playful poses, tail looping like a question mark through the air, suggesting motion even in a still sprite. Where Ditto is a puddle, Mew is a moment, frozen mid-turn, as if it has just noticed you and might dart away at any time. In that contrast, you can feel why people began to link them. One is a blank silhouette, the other a fully realized myth. One could be the clay, the other the finished statue. Tonight we're drifting into that space between them, where design and absence of design begin to feel like clues. Because Ditto's blankness does something strange, it makes Ditto incredibly easy to project onto. You can imagine it as a failed clone, left over from a hidden lab. You can see it as a wandering glitch from the missing No era, or as a universal breeder, a quiet genetic template waiting in the daycare. It can be anything because almost nothing is defined, and yet that same emptiness means the games give you very little to hold on to emotionally. Many other simple Pokémon were given small touches that turned minimalism into charm. A wobbling animation, a distinctive cry, a line in the Pokédex that hints at an ancient habit or a strange superstition. To this day, even the roundest, most featureless shapes often gained some spark of personality. Ditto, by contrast, usually sits still, its face unchanged, its form notable mainly when it stops being itself. It is defined more by what it copies than by what it is. In that sense, its visual and personality emptiness feels like another way Ditto is a kind of mistake, a concept that stopped at the first draft, never given the extra strokes that might have made it beloved on its own quiet terms. And yet, despite all this, Ditto has become iconic, a soft question mark in the fabric of the world, not to punish, but to reset our idea of what a Pokémon can be. In the next moments, we'll drift into why that very mistaken nature may be the reason we can't stop thinking about it. Living with the error. How Ditto endured and evolved. So now, with that soft question mark still hanging in the air, you can let your thoughts drift forward in time, past that rushed first draft of Kanto, into a world that slowly learned what to do with its little pink error. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and imagine Ditto not being erased or rewritten, but simply kept, like a typo that became part of the poem. As new generations unfolded, the games began to fold Ditto gently into their deeper machinery. In ancient times, back on those first cartridges, it was mostly a curiosity, a transform, and not much else. But later, in the quiet fields of the daycare, Ditto became something more, a universal partner able to share an egg with almost any species, a kind of living template moving through the hidden genetics of your team. Competitive players who cared about subtle numbers and invisible traits started to treasure perfect Dittos, not for their own strength, but for the future partners they could help bring into the world. Then came Imposter, an ability that allowed Ditto to mirror an opponent the moment it appeared. No setup, no delay, just instant reflection. Suddenly, this supposed mistake became a secret tool, slipping into high-level play as a quiet answer to almost anything. It was still the same formless blob, the same uncertain idea, but now it had a place in the careful balance of strategies and counters, a tiny reminder that even the strangest designs can find harmony with time. Outside the main games, Ditto found another kind of life. In the anime, you see Dittos that cannot quite get faces right, their eyes and mouths staying Ditto-shaped no matter what they become, turning mimicry into a gentle joke rather than a mystery. Merchandise followed, with Ditto-faced Pokémon toys and plushes where every creature, from Eevee to Gengar, wears that same simple expression. Tonight, we're drifting into a softer kind of myth, where Ditto's power to imitate becomes an excuse for play, self-aware, and affectionate. None of this truly answers where Ditto came from, or binds it officially to Mew. The journals in Cinnabar Mansion remain silent on its name. The Pokédex never whispers the word clone. Yet through all these small appearances, Ditto has gained a cultural personality, a lovable, slightly goofy shapeshifter that always seems to be pretending to be something else. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer watching a discarded idea slowly gather stories around itself. In a way, the franchise has embraced Ditto's strange, mistaken nature instead of correcting it. Its lack of a clear identity has become a running joke, a flexible tool in game design, in animation, in toys and memes, rather than a problem to be fixed. To this day, Ditto stands at the crossroads of all of these interpretations, a product of rushed design, a mechanical oddball, the fragile heart of a beautiful but probably wrong theory, and a survivor that quietly carved out a home. And as you drift towards sleep, you might wonder what it means that we have spent so long dreaming about this one small error, turning it into myth. If Ditto was a mistake, what other overlooked glitches and forgotten creatures are still waiting in the code of these worlds, ready to be rediscovered, reimagined, and perhaps in the next part of our story, revealed to be hiding in plain sight? Gathering the threads, what Ditto has shown us. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back over the quiet path we've taken with this small, formless creature. Tonight, we're drifting into a gentler kind of summary, not to solve anything once and for all, but to gather the loose threads of this story and lay them down where you can see them, side by side, before sleep. We began with something simple, a feeling that Ditto was just a little too close to Mew to be an accident. Two pink shapes, almost the same color, almost the same soft outline, sharing transform as their strange, singular trick. In the earliest games, they stood alone in that regard, the only ones who could turn into anything they met, as if they both remembered a time before species and categories, when the world was still deciding what it wanted to be. From there, the myth deepened. You followed Ditto's trail into the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, where the journals whisper about Mew, about cloning, about something going wrong. In the same crumbling rooms where Mewtwo's creation is recorded, Ditto appears, copying whatever it sees like a leftover echo of those experiments. In the daycare, Ditto becomes a universal template, able to pair with almost any Pokémon, quietly stitching new lives into existence as if it were a wandering fragment of genetic possibility. These became the pillars of the Ditto Mew theory, the shared move, the similar color and weight, the breeding quirks, the suspicious placement in the games. To this day, when you set their sprites side by side across generations, the resemblance feels like a secret the code is almost, but not quite, confessing. It is an elegant pattern, and your mind is very good at completing patterns. Yet along the way we also found the seams. Official law never quite says the words fans are listening for. Transform behaves in ways that feel more like mechanical convenience than sacred design. Some of Ditto's stranger behaviors, its awkward stats and odd limitations, seem less like deliberate myth and more like the leftovers of a rushed, ancient project, preserved because there was no time, or perhaps no need, to smooth them away. So Ditto becomes less an answer and more a lens. When you look through it, you see how players reach into the empty spaces of this world, filling gaps in time and space with stories about grief, failure, and second chances. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing the outline of an unfinished idea and deciding that the missing pieces must mean something. In ancient times, people told myths to explain the stars. Now, you listen to the quiet mysteries in a cartridge to explain why this world still feels alive. Think back to your first Mew, half legend and half glitch, and your first Ditto, wobbling and smiling, and how those early impressions colored everything you heard tonight. The supposed mistake in Ditto may not be a failure at all, but an invitation to imagine, to question, to dream softly around the edges of these stories where the answers stay just out of reach and the mystery itself becomes a kind of gentle, enduring balance. The shape of a mistake, what Ditto taught Game Freak. So now, as the mystery settles around you like a soft blanket, we can turn back to Ditto itself and to the quiet possibility that it was never meant to be what we received. Ditto in this light feels like the shape of a hesitation in the code, a design half remembered, mechanically awkward, narratively almost unused, and yet placed so strangely in the world, right beside the ruins of Mew's story in the Cinnabar Mansion. It seems to hover between intention and accident. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to that first generation, to the tiny cartridge that tried to hold an entire world. Development was hurried, memory was limited, and so much had to be cut or simplified. In that cramped space, some Pokémon emerged polished and clear, while others, like Ditto, feel more like sketches than finished paintings. A single move, transform, no real lore. Found in a mansion that whispers about Mewtwo, and in caves that feel like leftover corners of the map. It is as if Ditto is a reminder of everything that could not quite fit. In ancient times of game design, long before patches and updates, what was shipped was what remained, fossils of choices and compromises. Missing number, broken encounters, unused data, these are the obvious fragments. Ditto is gentler but similar. A universal breeding partner that can pair with almost any species. A pink, formless echo of Mew that shares its signature move, and, in some sprites, even its rounded posture and color. It behaves more like a concept than a character, a mechanic given just enough shape to exist. Tonight we're drifting into the way later generations seem to listen to those rough edges. The myths became clearer, legendaries were given deliberate stories, shrines and songs. Type? Null and Silvally were introduced as explicit cloning experiments, reflections of what Cinnabar's journals only implied. The worlds themselves grew more intentional, with laboratories, ruins, and research notes that connected mechanics to meaning. It is as though the designers looked back at Ditto and thought not never again, but next time with more care. In that sense, Ditto may be a quiet teacher, its strange presence near Mewtwo's origin, its role as a universal genetic template, its lack of a personal myth. All of these gaps seem to have nudged the series toward fuller, more coherent stories about creation, memory, and responsibility. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing how a supposed mistake can bend the arc of a mythic world. To this day, Ditto feels like a fossil of early design thinking, preserved inside the cartridge like amber around a prehistoric insect. Imperfect, cloudy, yet priceless, because it shows the outline of what the creators were reaching for. You have Dittos in your own life as well. Unfinished ideas, awkward attempts, strange leftovers that do not quite say what you meant. They too are teachers. They mark where your world was too small for your imagination, and they point, gently, toward the space you might grow into next. Mew, Ditto, and the stories we needed. And sometimes, when a world feels a little too small for its own imagination, stories appear to stretch it. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can feel one of those stories forming in the quiet space between Mew and Ditto. On one side there is Mew, hidden, secretive, almost mythical. In red and blue it is not on the box, not in the Pokédex you are meant to complete, not in any ordinary patch of grass. It lives in rumors, playground whispers, and the idea of a perfect ancient ancestor, of all Pokémon. On the other side, there is Ditto, common, squishy, overlooked, sitting in caves and laboratories like a misplaced note. Two extremes that seemed, to early players, too perfectly opposite not to be connected. In ancient times of the playground, before official explanations were easy to find, children standing in Kanto's pixelated fields did what humans always do with a half-told myth. They looked for patterns. They noticed that Mew and Ditto both used transform, that their colors and shapes could blur together in certain sprites, that Ditto appeared in the same Pokémon Mansion where Mewtwo's experiments were described. In a world full of gaps, the mind gently fills in the missing lines. Tonight, we're drifting into the emotional part of that pattern. The theory says somewhere in a lab echoing with machines, people tried to copy a perfect being. What emerged again and again was not Mew, but something softer and sadder. A failed clone, unable to be itself, existing only to imitate others. You imagine these Ditto, lonely and imperfect, left behind in abandoned rooms and deep caves, like spilled ink from a story that was never meant to be read. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer listening for the quiet feelings under the data. The Ditto Mew theory gives Ditto a tragic backstory it never officially received. Instead of a simple blob, it becomes a symbol of failure and experimentation, but also of resilience because it survives. It learns to live by copying, to find a place in nature and in your team, not through strength, but through adaptability. In that way, Ditto becomes strangely human. To this day, many people carry the sense of wanting to be like someone else, to mirror a kind of perfection they think exists somewhere outside themselves. You try on roles, imitate heroes, compare your rough edges to someone else's polished surface, and you live with the quiet feeling of not quite measuring up. Ditto's endless transform is that feeling, turned into a creature. The theory lasted not because it was airtight, but because it met a quiet emotional need. It made Kanto deeper, darker, more complex, hinting that beneath the bright colors there were consequences, regrets, and experiments that did not end neatly. Even if it is never confirmed, the feelings it captured are real, and that makes the story meaningful in its own way. Yet if stories can heal gaps in the heart, they can also hide gaps in the code. And when you look closely at Ditto's place in the games themselves, another, stranger picture begins to emerge. Canon, headcanon, and the space between. When you look closely like that, the edges of the Ditto story start to blur, and another kind of question appears, soft and persistent. What do you do when the world you imagine doesn't quite line up with the world the code insists on? Close your eyes and let your mind wander for a moment back to the quiet rules that hold the games together. Official canon resists the Ditto Mew myth in small, steady ways. There are no lines in any Pokédex entry that whisper of failed clones, no journals in Cinnabar Mansion that mention a pink, melting echo of Mew among the experiments. Later regions move on to other mysteries, other legends, leaving Ditto behind as a simple mechanic, a transform machine, a gentle blob that exists to copy, to breed, to keep the balance of teams and encounters. Its moveset is almost comically plain, a single transform where Mew carries a whole world of possibilities. Its stats are tuned not for drama but for practicality, a neutral template that can become anything and yet is by itself almost nothing. These are choices that feel pragmatic rather than poetic, decisions made so the game can function, not to deepen an ancient myth. And yet your head does not have to listen to those limits. Headcanon moves differently in a quieter space that belongs to feeling more than to fact. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, tracing emotional lines where the official story stays silent. To this day, so many players still hold the gentle belief that Ditto is what happens when someone tried to make a Mew and almost succeeded. It is a shared dream, passed along playgrounds and early internet forums, a communal story that lives between cartridges and memory. Tonight, we're drifting into that in-between, that dream zone, where canon and headcanon overlap like two translucent sprites. The games leave gaps on purpose or by accident, and in those blank spaces you are quietly invited to imagine the connective tissue yourself. In this space, the lack of confirmation is not a rejection, it is a kind of open doorway. Pokémon has always lived here, in these soft myths that are not quite official and not quite false. In ancient times of the fandom, people whispered about Lavender Town's music and what it might hide, about missing Nubru as a secret guardian of broken data, about the strange truck by the SS, and that surely concealed Mew. None of these stories were canon, and yet they shaped how the world felt, how mysterious its nature seemed when you were half awake in front of a small, glowing screen. It is all right for something to be not officially true and still be deeply meaningful, comforting, or inspiring. You do not have to choose between the Pokédex and your own quiet myth. You can let them sit side by side, shifting like Ditto's outline, never fully fixed. If you hold the theory with a gentle, flexible hand, you no longer need a final answer. You can simply enjoy the mood it creates, laboratories after midnight, data flickering, a small pink shape on a table that remembers being something more. And somewhere, deeper in the code, other silences are waiting. What hidden stories might still be sleeping there, waiting for someone's head canon to wake them up? The comfort of unfinished stories. Those other silences are important because they remind you of how much of early Pokémon was made of gaps and unfinished thoughts. The world you walked through in those first games was not a polished museum, but a half-lit attic, full of boxes that were never labeled, doors that opened into empty rooms, and scraps of story that stopped mid-sentence. In ancient times of your own memory, you might remember the first time you heard about a glitched encounter or missing note. A friend at school would whisper that if you surfed along the edge of Cinnabar, the sea itself would bend and something impossible would appear. There were unexplained rooms in places like Silphco and Saffron, doors that led nowhere, sprites that never spoke. The Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island had diary pages about Mew, and then suddenly the pages just ended. No neat conclusion. No final report. Just a quiet, abandoned lab and the sound of your own footsteps. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and you can feel how strangely soothing those gaps were. Like a bedtime story told by a tired parent, trailing off before the final line, leaving you to finish it in your head as you drifted towards sleep. The missing explanations became soft places where your imagination could curl up. Not everything demanded an answer. Some things were allowed to remain a mood. Ditto lives right inside that mood. Its origin is never fully explained. Its body is a suggestion rather than a statement. A little pink shape, almost like Mew, that knows only transform, the same strange move that Mew keeps hidden in its gentle list of possibilities. It appears in the same ruined mansion where the Mewtwo experiments are recorded, as if it slipped out of a broken test tube and then out of the script entirely. Ditto feels like an unfinished character in an unfinished world, and that incompleteness invites you to wonder quietly, instead of demanding proof. As you grow older, you are taught to crave closure. Stories must resolve, questions must be answered, loose ends must be tied into careful bows. But your younger self played in the unknown. You made up rules for missing mechanics, invented reasons for unused rooms, decided for yourself what the diary never wrote down. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and back then, dreaming was enough. Tonight, we're drifting into that older way of listening. You are invited to let Ditto remain a question mark, a soft, shifting outline that never quite settles into one truth. Some stories are meant to stay open-ended so that each person can tuck their own meaning into the empty spaces, like placing a favorite plush into the corner of a quiet room. As you listen now, you can simply lie back and let your thoughts move the way Ditto does, slow and formless, taking on shapes for a moment and then melting away again. The unanswered parts of the Mew theory become a kind of lullaby, not to solve, but to sway you gently until the need for certainty loosens and sleep arrives in its own time. If Ditto wasn't a mistake after all, and as those thoughts drift, we circle quietly back to the title that brought you here. Why Ditto was a mistake. After everything you've seen in this soft little corner of the Pokémon world, that word begins to feel a little heavy, a little too sharp for something so small and yielding. On the surface, it is easy to understand why people chose it. Ditto is awkward when you try to use it seriously, always arriving one turn late, always copying instead of leading. Its story in the official lore is almost absent, a blank line where other Pokémon receive legends, temples, or at least a heartfelt Pokédex entry. To this day, it stands in the shadow of more iconic shapes. Mew's playful grace, Mewtwo's tragic power, starters and legendaries that define whole regions, while Ditto waits in the daycare or in a forgotten box. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, though, and another picture comes into focus. From that supposed misstep came one of the richest myths the community ever wove, the idea of Ditto as a failed Mew, a leftover echo of an experiment in the mansion on Cinnabar Island. Players noticed the shared transform move, the soft pink color, the way both seemed like raw possibilities rather than finished creatures. In ancient times of the early internet, message boards and playground conversations turned this into a living story, passed from friend to friend like a secret. Out of this mistake grew emotional narratives, scientists pushing too far, gentle creatures discarded, memories trapped in jelly-like forms that can never quite be themselves. Ditto became a symbol for imperfection and transformation, for the way you sometimes mold yourself into whatever the world expects, even when your true shape is uncertain. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer watching a small, wobbly Pokémon stand in for all the versions of yourself you've tried on and outgrown. When something labeled an error begins to inspire creativity, connection, and quiet reflection, it stops being a mistake in the usual sense and becomes more like a catalyst. The world of Pokémon is full of these accidents that aren't, a glitch like missing no, turning into a campfire ghost story, a misprinted card becoming a treasured heirloom, a side character like N or AZ stepping unexpectedly into the center of the myth and changing how you see everything around them. Tonight we're drifting into that gentle realization that value isn't always where the designers intended it to be. Ditto may never receive a grand cutscene or a shrine, but it has become a quiet success, hiding inside a failure, a reminder that the softest, strangest parts of a world often hold the most personal meaning. And perhaps Ditto's true role is exactly what you're feeling now, an excuse to slow down, to wonder, to let memories of Kanto and Cinnabar and old save files float through the dim space of your room until the story thins into dream and sleep takes their place. Your own Kanto, making the theory personal, so now, as those places drift through your thoughts like old photographs, you can gently turn the story toward yourself. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, not to charts or stats or proofs, but to the first time Kanto ever opened in front of you on a small glowing screen in a quiet room that might feel very far away and very close all at once. Perhaps you remember where you were, curled on the floor near a charger, or in the back seat of a car as the world outside slid by in the dark. The music was simple, almost tinny, yet somehow vast, as if that looping root theme contained an entire world of possibility. The colors were limited, the pixels blocky, but your mind filled in the space between them, smoothing the edges into forests, oceans, and an ancient region waiting just for you. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, quietly tracing those first steps again. To this day, the opening notes of Pallet Town or the soft echo of Lavender's theme may still pull you backward through time, straight into that first save file, that first sense that Kanto was more than a game, that it was a place you could return to whenever you needed its gentle, familiar light. Somewhere in that memory, Ditto and Mew are waiting. Maybe you first heard of Mew, not from the game itself, but from a friend on the playground, a magazine article, or a whispered rumor about a hidden Pokémon under a mysterious truck by the harbor. Maybe Ditto appeared as a strange pink shape in the Pokémon Mansion, or in a patch of grass where everything else felt ordinary and it alone felt like a question given form. Tonight, we're drifting into those small private legends you built around them. The journals in the mansion, the locked doors, the ash-colored tiles, the shadows in Cerulean Cave, where something unseen seemed to breathe just off-screen. Your version of the Ditto Mew myth lives there, in the way you imagined failed experiments, secret labs, and soft, unfinished stories hidden behind the walls. You do not need anyone's permission to decide what Ditto truly is. In the quiet of your own canon, it can be a failed clone, a design error that slipped through development, a cosmic joke left by the universe, or a quiet guardian of all the shapes and lives that never quite made it into the light. Your choice settles into the world like a new layer of sediment, subtle but permanent. Because your personal canon is not less real than an official statement, it is simply rooted in a different soil. It is woven into where you were when you first played, who you were becoming, the way the glow of the screen lit your hands. Every time you return to Kanto, you are walking through those layers, through time and space and memory, revisiting not just routes and towns, but older versions of yourself watching the same pixels, dreaming the same dream. In ancient times, people told myths to explain the stars. Now you tell yourself small Pokémon stories to explain why a pink blob and a hidden legendary feel connected in your chest. Let that be enough. Let there be a bit of silence around it, a gentle pause where you simply feel what you want to believe and keep it like a secret. And as we move deeper into the code and history of these games, into the strange places where glitches and design choices blur together, you may find that your quiet theory about Ditto is not as alone as it once seemed. From cartridges to dreams. Why these myths stay with us, you may find that your quiet theory about Ditto is not as alone as it once seemed. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, back to those first cartridges and tiny screens. Think about how a single sprite, a single sound effect, can linger in the corners of your memory for years, then suddenly surface again when you see a screenshot or hear that soft 8-bit cry through a wall of sleep. To this day, the simple pop of a Pokeball opening can feel like someone gently opening a door in your mind. Long before you learn the word data, you learned the shape of Pidgey's wings, the curve of Mew's tail, the strange, simple blob that was Ditto. You saw them over and over, not just as pixels, but as tiny companions who waited for you after school, late at night, in the quiet spaces when the world seemed far away. Over time, repetition did something subtle. Kanto stopped being a map on a screen and became a place in your inner world, a private myth you could return to whenever you needed it. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. Your mind takes these repeated paths and slowly turns them into legend. The more you walk that same route from Pallet Town to Viridian Forest, the less it feels like code, and the more it feels like a childhood road you once walked in real nature, under an ancient sky. The same patch of grass where you once caught a caterpie becomes, in memory, as sacred as any real meadow you've known. The Ditto Mew theory fits into this pattern like a missing puzzle piece. Our minds are drawn toward gaps and glitches, toward questions the game never quite answers. A pink blob that knows transform and appears in the same mansion where Mewtwo's creation is recorded feels like an invitation. The world of the game does not say clearly what Ditto is. So you answer for it. You let your imagination step into that empty space, and suddenly the story feels more alive, more responsive, as if the cartridge itself were listening. There is something soothing in that. Returning to these myths is like returning to a familiar room where the furniture has shifted slightly, but the light through the window is the same. Each time you revisit the Ditto Mew idea, you might adjust a detail, add a scene in the lab, picture another failed experiment or a lonely Ditto wandering the ruins, but the feeling remains constant and gentle. Over the years, the exact truth of the theory begins to matter less than the ritual of telling it. It becomes like a bedtime story you quietly repeat to yourself, changing a few words, adding a new image, but always ending in the same soft place. In ancient times, people gathered around fires to retell the same myths. Now you gather around a dim screen or an audio track and do something very similar, and you are not alone in it. There is a quiet bond in the way someone mentions Ditto and Mew in the same breath, and another person simply nods understanding without explanation. A shared smile, a shared memory of Cinnabar's mansion, of that strange pink shape, creates a thread between strangers across time and space. Tonight we're drifting into that shared space together. As you lie back, listening, remembering, you are adding one more layer to this living story. Your breathing, your half-formed images of labs and oceans and soft, changing shapes become part of the ongoing myth-making that surrounds these games. And as we move on deeper into the code, the glitches, and the quiet corners of Kanto's design, you may begin to see how many other little mistakes and mysteries have grown into legends of their own. One last look at the lab door. So now, as those little pieces of code and rumor settle in your thoughts, let them guide you back to a place you already know. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, and in your mind's eye you are returning to Cinnabar Island, to the quiet silhouette of the Pokémon Mansion, leaning gently against the night like an old forgotten story. The doors give way without protest, and you step once more onto broken tiles, their patterns interrupted by cracks and missing pieces. Dust hangs in the air like pale fog, softening the edges of everything. Somewhere deeper inside there is the faint, unreliable flicker of unseen machinery, tiny indicator lights that should have gone dark long ago, still keeping time for no one. You walk slowly, without hurry, along corridors you have already traced in memory. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, moving past scorched walls and fallen beams, past the scattered journals whose pages you could almost recite now. Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. To this day, those lines seem to echo here, as if the ink itself remembers. Tonight, we're drifting into a quieter version of that myth. No alarms, no rushing footsteps, only the soft sound of your own breathing as you pass open doors and dim laboratories each one an empty stage where experiments ended long ago. Glassware rests in careful disarray, clipboards lie sideways, and old monitors glow with a tired greenish light, more like distant stars than screens. If you listen, you can almost imagine that one of those rooms is not entirely empty. In a forgotten corner laboratory behind a pane of clouded glass, a single containment unit hums very softly. Inside, perhaps, a Ditto rests, its form a gentle, rippling mound of pink, rising and falling as if in sleep. Or perhaps it has already slipped free, leaving only a faint smear on the glass, like a memory deciding to move on. Farther in, the hallway narrows and you find yourself before a locked lab door, heavier than the others, framed in metal that has outlasted almost everything else. There is a slot for a keycard that no one carries anymore. You know, in that quiet, accepting way that whatever waits beyond that door will probably never be fully revealed, not in code, not in law, not even in the most careful theories. And somehow that feels comforting. In ancient times, people left shrines and ruins half unexplained, not to punish, but to reset the mind into wonder, to preserve a space where questions could remain softly open. This door is like that, a boundary that keeps the mystery intact, a reminder that not every story in this world needs an ending. So you take one final, slow breath in that hallway, acknowledging everything you have learned and imagined about Mew, about Ditto, about experiments and accidents, and happy mistakes. Then, with a small, almost ceremonial turn, you leave the door behind and walk back through the mansion, past the journals, past the quiet lights, out into the Cinnabar night. The sea air is cool, the world is wide, and the lab and its secrets settle back into the dark, waiting patiently as we continue on to other hidden corners of Kanto's design. Carrying Ditto with you, a quiet call to wonder. The sea air is cool, the world is wide, and somewhere behind you, that quiet mansion folds back into shadow. As you walk away, the story of Ditto and Mew does not close. It simply settles like dust in a beam of lamplight, waiting for the next time you decide to stir it. Close your eyes and let your mind wander, just for a moment, to the next time you pick up a Pokémon game or open an old save you haven't touched in years. You move through familiar routes, the same grass, the same caves, but now there is a softer layer laid over everything, a gentle awareness that in the small gaps and oddities, new myths can grow. A strangely placed NPC, an empty room, a move that seems a little too perfect for a certain Pokémon. Each one can become a tiny campfire where your own stories begin. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer. When you see a Ditto in the wild or tucked away in a daycare box, you might remember how it sits in the code, like a universal template, able to pair with almost anything, able to become almost anyone. You might notice how Mew and Ditto share that simple move, transform, and how, to this day, they echo each other in color and shape. None of this has to be evidence. It can simply be an invitation. You could pass that invitation along. Maybe you tell a friend who only half remembers Cinnabar Island, or a younger sibling meeting Kanto for the first time, that there is a theory about a little pink blob and a forgotten ancestor. You do not have to explain every detail. You can tell it the way people tell stories in ancient times around a quiet room before sleep. Some say Ditto was once meant to be Mew and the world just kept it anyway. The words don't prove, they gently glow. From there, other myths open up, like side paths. Tonight, we're drifting into a way of seeing where fan theories and headcanons are not arguments to win, but different verses of the same lullaby. One person imagines Lavender Town's radio as a bridge between worlds. Another sees Missing No as the ghost of cut ideas, and you carry Ditto as the symbol of a world that embraces its own unfinished shapes. If you'd like, you can let Ditto mean something a little more personal. A reminder that it is all right to be in flux, to be trying on different forms of yourself, never fully fixed, always a little in between. In the balance between who you were and who you might become, Ditto waits patient and formless, proof that being unfinished can still be complete enough for now. And if, on some other quiet night, you feel the need for this same slow, contemplative space, you can always return to more theories, more videos, more readings that move at the pace of your own breathing, or you can do nothing at all. The story of Ditto and Mew will simply rest at the back of your mind, like a closed book within arm's reach, ready to open again when we turn to another secret that has been hiding in Kanto's design all along. Drifting off, with Ditto a soft goodbye. And as that closed book rests within arm's reach in the quiet of your room, you realize that this little journey with Ditto has moved in a circle, not a straight line. You began with a small, bright spark of curiosity, wondering whether this pink, shifting shape was a mistake, a leftover glitch from a crowded piece of code, or a failed echo of Mew that slipped into the world when no one was looking. Along the way, you traced the soft threads of the Ditto Mew myth, the shared move of transform, the matching color in so many sprites, the way both feel like raw possibility given form. You wandered through Cinnabar's ruined mansion in your memory, reading those fragmented notes about experiments and creation, and you listened to all the contradictions that made the theory wobble and blur at the edges. Not to prove anything, simply to see how the story felt when you held it up to the light. Now at the end, there is no verdict waiting for you, no final answer that locks everything into place. Instead, there is a kind of quiet balance. The real value of this theory was never in being right or wrong. It has always lived in the feelings it stirred, the late-night conversations with friends, the way early internet whispers turned a handful of pixels into a living myth. To this day, people still bring Ditto and Mew together in their minds, not because they must, but because it feels like a secret door into Kanto's hidden spaces. This isn't the journey of a champion, but of a dreamer, and dreamers are allowed to leave some corners of the map uncolored. It is all right that parts of Kanto remain a little blurry, that some sprites on that old Game Boy screen never quite resolve into certainty. In ancient times, stories were told not to close every question, but to give people something gentle to carry with them into the dark. So if your eyes are still open, you can let them fall shut now. Close your eyes and let your mind wander back to that soft glow of a handheld screen, to the tiny looping animation of Ditto melting and reforming, to the idea of Mew floating just off-screen, somewhere beyond the edge of programmed space. Tonight, we're drifting into something softer than certainty, into a world where not knowing is its own kind of comfort. Feel your breathing slow like the gentle pulse of the console in your hands, and let Ditto's formless, patient shape fade into a calm haze. The worlds you love, pixelated or real, will still be here when you wake, waiting at the pace of your own steps, ready to be explored again whenever you wish. For now, let Ditto rest not as a mistake, but as a soft, shifting outline at the edge of sleep, keeping quiet watch over the dreams of trainers and dreamers alike, until morning finds you and you press continue once more.